This hearing will come to order. The title of this hearing, colleagues, is Syria After the Missile Strikes, Policy Options. Some of us had the opportunity over the last week to meet with what is called the Blue Helmets, and these are Syrian volunteers. These are civil society people. I think one who I talked to was a accountant. She was an accountant. Another one was a firefighter. But they come from all ethnic and religious and political factions inside Syria. What these civil society people all have in common is that they are the ones that you see on television who are rushing into collapsing buildings to rescue people, a stranger or friend, and then try to take them to the hospital. And many of these hospitals are under bombardment. They've saved some 70,000 people. And if you have an opportunity, you should hear their stories and hear their plea that we all try to use whatever political leverage we have to try to get Assad and the other factions to the table. But this morning we consider options for Syria in the wake of this month's renewed chemical attacks by Bashar al-Assad and the bold response we saw from the administration. On April 4th, facing an opposition offensive against key infrastructure, the regime in Syria launched a sarin gas attack in southern Idlib province. 85 people, including many children, died from that attack. The effects of sarin gas are immediate. The nose runs, eyes water, the mouth drools, and this progresses to convulsions, paralysis, and in many cases death in less than 10 minutes. There is a reason indiscriminate killing of chemicals and chemical attacks cross a red line. There is a reason for that, and the reason is it is abhorrent. Assad was sending a demoralizing message to the civilian population there. It was, I can kill with impunity, with some of the worst weapons of war, and no one will help you. But in a matter of days, the Syrian regime did pay a price. 2 days later, nearly 60 Tomahawk missiles fired from U.S. Navy ships operating in international waters targeted the Syrian airfield from which the sarin attacks had launched. In a limited and targeted response, U.S. forces destroyed 23 Syrian warplanes and supporting infrastructure. This use of force was proportional, legitimate, and welcomed by our allies in the region and around the world. For after 6 years of unrestrained murder of Syrians, Assad was finally on the receiving end. Finally, red lines mattered. Finally, the United States was leading, and this week the Treasury Department sanctioned 270 individuals involved in Syria's production of chemical weapons. Now, having taken military action, the United States has a chance to take Syria policy on a different path. As one witness will testify today, quote, determined U.S. leadership, backed up by the credible and now proven threat of force, presents the best opportunity in years to strong-arm actors on the ground into a phase of meaningful de-escalation, out of which eventually a durable negotiation process may result. A good place to start this forceful diplomacy would be to make Russia and Iran pay a price for supporting Assad. So far, they have had no incentive to negotiate an end to the conflict in Syria, as they have been able to pursue their goals with little cost. That calculus would surely change if Mr. Engel's Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act was passed by the Congress and signed into law and vigorously enforced. This sweeping sanctions bill is guaranteed to get attention in Moscow and Tehran and give the UN-backed process aimed at finding a political solution a chance. And while the administration sticks to an ISIS-first strategy, this too can push the political process along. As U.S.-backed forces gain ground in the east, Assad could be confined to the west, opening up sanctuaries in which Syrians might find refuge and establish basic governance. From there, the United States and our allies must work together to advance a plausible vision of a post-Assad Syria. This won't be easy, but Syria can't keep going on and on like this. That's not in our humanitarian interest, not in the interest of the region, or America's national security interest. This has to change. I now turn to the ranking member who has long been focused on this conflict for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me also thank our witnesses and welcome you all to the Foreign Affairs Committee. This morning, the committee will continue its examination of a challenge that for more than 6 years, global powers have been unable or unwilling to resolve: the brutal war that Bashar al-Assad and his enablers have waged against the people of Syria. Hundreds of thousands are dead at the hands of his butcher. Millions more have been driven from their homes, and every time the potential for a resolution has been in sight, Assad has been granted another lifeline. The missile strike earlier this month escalated American involvement against Assad to a new level. I think the response was appropriate. But a few weeks down the road, we're left asking, where do we go from here? What are our objectives in Syria? What's the strategy? And the short answer is this: at this point, there seems to be no strategy. A pinpoint missile strike is not a strategy. That's a problem for the people of Syria, and it's part of a troubling pattern from the White House. In 100 short days, the administration has escalated tensions with North Korea, owing to reckless saber-rattling, gone hot and cold on China, cozied up to Putin, and caused diplomatic embarrassments with some of our closest allies. At the same time, most top State Department posts remain vacant, and the expertise of our diplomats is clearly being ignored. You cannot fly by the seat of your pants when it comes to foreign policy. On the global stage, policy by improvisation confuses our friends and tees up opportunities for our adversaries. For example, I'm convinced that the administration's reversal on the long-held policy of removing Assad emboldened him to carry out the sarin gas attack in the first place. If indeed there is a strategy, Congress has been kept in the dark. We were told that the administration would soon prevent us with its plan. That hasn't happened. I think back to the 2011 strike in Libya, which also took place during a recess, and there was a lot of criticism for that. But the week Congress returned, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Gates, Chair of the Joint Chiefs Mullen, and D&I Clapper were all here on Capitol Hill telling lawmakers about the path forward. Whether we agreed with it or didn't agree with it, we at least learned about it. So far, no such briefing has been scheduled on Syria, and of course, no administration witnesses are testifying before us today because so few senior State Department officials are in place. So while we wait for the administration to draw up a strategy, there are a few things the President and his team should bear in mind. First, military action alone will not solve the crisis in Syria. Only a political transition, one that removes Assad from power, will put the Syrian people on the path towards rebuilding and recharting the course for their country's future. We need the means to help push that process forward. My bill that I introduced with Chairman Royce, the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, would provide some of those tools to pressure Assad and his patrons in Moscow and Tehran. The House passed the bill unanimously last year, and I'm grateful to Chairman Royce for planning to mark up this legislation again next week. We also need senior diplomats in a place who can drive the policies that will lead to a solution. It's nearly May. The President has only just announced his pick for Deputy Secretary of State, and he hasn't even nominated an Undersecretary for Political Affairs or Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. And rather than working to fill these vacancies as quickly as possible, the administration instead seems intent on slashing the resources needed to conduct effective diplomacy. We learned about that at the last hearing we had. Second, there must be no further American military action in Syria without congressional say-so. The 60-day War Powers Resolution clock started ticking when President Trump notified Congress of the missile strike. The President must come to Congress if his Syria strategy includes military involvement. No matter anyone's view of how we should grapple with this problem, Congress's voice must be heard, and we will not simply give this administration or any administration a blank check. For now, we'll keep pushing the administration for answers and pressing for a strategy that will advance a political solution, get Assad out of power, and end the suffering of the Syrian people. I'm grateful to our witnesses for sharing their views on what such a strategy looks like, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We did pass our bill out of this committee and out of the House last year. We're going to have an opportunity in light of events. We couldn't get it out of the Senate last year, but we're going to try to get it out of the Senate this year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as usual, your help was invaluable.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. And now this morning, we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. Mr. Mike Singh is the Managing Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and previously he served at the White House, where he oversaw the Middle East policy from 2005 to 2008. And we have Mr. Charles Lister. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Initiative. Previously, Mr. Lister was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. He has been deeply focused on Syria policy for some time. Dr. Daphna Rand is an adjunct professor at the National Defense University. Previously, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. So without objection, our witnesses' full prepared statements are going to be made part of the record, and members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements as well, or any questions of you, or any extraneous materials for the record. And so, Mr. Singh, this always works best if you could summarize your remarks, and we'll begin with you.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you for having me here, and thank you for your hard work on this issue. Our past efforts to resolve or contain the conflict in Syria did not succeed, far from it. It is not now a civil war, but a regional conflict that has drawn in Syria's neighbors and has had broad geopolitical ramifications beyond, including terrorism and a refugee crisis in Europe and political turbulence throughout the West. Our problem in Syria is not simply an ISIS problem, but runs much deeper, and I want to talk about those broader ramifications. The Trump administration's start, I agree with both of you, has been promising. The April 7th strike was decisive, and it served a clear, if narrow, interest, deterring the use of chemical weapons and enhancing our military credibility in Syria. But devising our broader Syria policy will be much more complicated and will require a similarly clear understanding of our interests and objectives and the development of options to advance them. And I think we need to begin with a quick assessment of the situation, which will reveal just how much the conflict has roiled the regional politics. This is not, in fact, a single conflict, but it's playing out over, I would say, 4 distinct zones. Each one of those zones has different internal and external actors involved. So, for example, in western Syria, both Iran and Russia are defending the Assad regime's remaining territory, which has shrunk, but for different reasons. Iran seeks to preserve Syria as a channel for the projection of power into the Levant, whereas Russia, I think, wants to reassert a global role, thwart American aims in Syria, and preserve and expand its influence in the Middle East. Turkey, for its part, has long advocated that the Assad regime, that Assad himself should step aside, but increasingly Ankara is focused on preventing the aggrandizement of the Kurds. And its chief aims now seem to be preventing the establishment of a contiguous Kurdish territory along the Syrian side of the Turkish border and preventing the United States from providing heavy weapons and training to the Kurds and their Arab partners in the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. If we look at Israel, Israel, for its part, is alarmed at the possibility of Iran and Hezbollah establishing a presence along the Golan Heights, and very wary about what seems to be an emerging Russia, Iran, Hezbollah axis. And then finally, Jordan, our other good partner in this region, worries about new refugee flows. It's already dealing with almost 1 million refugees, as well as about the ISIS and Iranian presence on its northwestern border. It's an enormously complex situation, and I think we need to avoid framing our policy as an effort to sort of solve Syria, as it were, in one fell swoop or one neat package. Instead, we need to focus on setting discrete objectives that will protect our interests. And I recommend 3 in particular. First, I think we need to seek to prevent the Syria conflict from further destabilizing the region. It could get worse, as bad as it is now in this region. So in western Syria, including the Idlib region, where the fight is increasingly between the Assad regime and its backers on the one hand and a jihadist-dominated opposition on the other, I think our chief concern needs to be for the millions of civilians who are caught in the middle of that fight. So we should continue providing humanitarian relief. We've provided more than any other country so far, providing escape routes for those civilians. But I think we also need to make clear, building on the April 7th strike, that further atrocities against civilians by Assad, by his backers, could prompt the further use of force. I think that credible military threat needs to be there. In southern Syria, we need to support our allies Israel and Jordan as they seek to prevent the conflict from spilling over their borders and as they seek to push ISIS back from their borders. And then in northern Syria, where we've recently had this Turkish bombing of Kurdish positions, I think our chief aim needs to be to calm those Turkish-Kurdish tensions, urging Ankara to not engage in any more uncoordinated bombing, but also urging the Syrian Kurds, the YPG, to sever their ties with the PKK, which is a terrorist group, and where Turkey has a legitimate concern. And as we plan Raqqa's liberation, I think we need to aim, ideally, to keep local Arab forces up front and to involve both the Turks and Kurds to the extent we can in the operation, rather than choosing one or the other in a way that will unbalance the politics there. And I think we also need to consider modestly increasing our own troop commitment, as we have in northern Iraq, so that we can play an effective coordinating role between those various forces. Our second objective, I think, should be to push back on Iran and prevent it from using the Syria conflict to expand its power. Iran's deeply entrenched in western Syria, but it shouldn't get a free pass for its use of foreign fighters and its support for the Assad regime. And we need to keep up the pressure on Iran and Iranian entities that are involved in this effort. And now is the time also to ramp up the pressure on Hezbollah and to renew our support for the government of Lebanon, which is deeply involved in this issue as well. And then finally, we need to work with Israel and Jordan to ensure that Iran and its proxies don't establish a new front along the Golan Heights that I think would inflame tensions in this region for years to come. Finally, thirdly, and quickly, our third objective needs to be to ensure that ISIS and al-Qaeda are denied safe haven after Raqqa's liberation, so they can't return. So we're not dealing with this problem yet again in the coming years. So the training and equipment we provide those local partners, I think, needs to be oriented not just towards defeating ISIS, not just that near-term goal, but also providing security for the local population afterwards. And we shouldn't just support security forces, we need to support local civil society who can help with the governance and rebuilding of eastern Syria. I think both of these efforts will require international assistance, and I think to the extent we can, we should push our Arab allies to get involved in that effort rather than having this be a sort of U.S.-only effort. Just in closing, members of the committee, it's critical that we defeat ISIS, but how we go about defeating ISIS and how we pursue our other aims in Syria are going to have lasting ramifications for the geopolitics of the Middle East and for our own security. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lester.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to testify on this very important subject. Today, the Assad regime is sat more comfortably in Damascus than at any point since the start of the crisis in early 2011. Its recent use of chemical weapons is almost certainly a result of that confidence. However, if anyone believes that Assad is now the key to stabilizing Syria, they are sorely mistaken. Assad will never be capable of putting Syria back together again. Not only does his continued survival represent radicalization gold dust, it also fuels the continued exodus of his own population. So what now? Clearly, the status quo is not working. Determined US leadership, backed up by a credible threat of force and a holistic underpinning strategy, represents the best opportunity to strong-arm actors into a phase of meaningful de-escalation, out of which a durable negotiation process may eventually result. Punitive strikes and other assertive acts of diplomacy will be inevitable. But if anything is now clear, it's that we have far more freedom of action in Syria than the previous administration was ever willing to admit. Opponents of limited US intervention, who long and confidently pronounced the inevitability of conflict with Russia, are now faced with the reality that Russia failed to lift a finger when American missiles careered towards Assad regime targets. The first step to developing a more effective Syria policy is to acknowledge that Syria can be divided into dozens of unique semi-contained conflicts, and that countering terrorism isn't enough to protect our interests. We need a holistic strategy that treats all of Syria's various symptoms as interlinked components of one big root cause. The fight against ISIS in Syria has made significant progress, but we must acknowledge the challenges ahead and the disadvantageous effects of certain aspects of our strategy. The big looming challenge is the fight for Raqqa, and the issue at hand is who our local partners are for that battle. The favored status given thus far to the Kurdish YPG has created serious issues with our NATO ally Turkey, which claims the YPG is affiliated to the PKK, a movement that we ourselves consider a terrorist organization. In fact, the YPG's direct affiliation with the PKK was publicly acknowledged repeatedly by our very own National Counterterrorism Center until we began working with the group in 2014. We need Turkey as a constructive partner. Laudable efforts have been undertaken to recruit Arabs to fight alongside the YPG, but the YPG retains overwhelming influence over tactics, strategy, and outcomes. The YPG also maintains ambiguous relations with the Assad regime. Already, territory captured from ISIS, thanks to intensive US assistance, has been handed back to the Assad regime and to Russia. A YPG-led victory in Raqqa would almost certainly lead to a similar result, which would embolden extremists and create the conditions for new conflict. We do not need to rush Raqqa, and it is not at all clear that our existing partners are capable of taking the city. Instead, we should use our influence with Turkey to push for a ceasefire with the PKK, which may help ease tensions with the YPG in Syria. As part of a package deal, we could then offer to include a portion of Turkey's anti-Assad forces, most of which are already vetted by the CIA and CENTCOM, into a broader Raqqa offensive. This would be a similar arrangement to that which we worked out for Mosul in Iraq. While our eyes have been firmly fixed on ISIS, al-Qaeda has thrived in Syria. It sought to deeply embed itself into Syria's broad opposition movement. It's adapted its narrative to fit that much of the opposition, and it studiously avoided many of the extremist practices typically associated with al-Qaeda. This use of what I call controlled pragmatism is in marked difference from ISIS and means that countering al-Qaeda in Syria necessitates the use of a very different toolkit. This is a struggle defined by a competition for narrative victory. 6 years of violence and no determined international action to stop it has provided al-Qaeda with an increasingly pliable population and an opportunity to exploit its principal advantage, its power in battle. Determined action to protect civilians and deter regime war crimes, paired with a substantial reduction in conflict, would represent a serious threat to al-Qaeda. However, greater pressure is needed on its most important area of operations, the province of Idlib. This is a problem that only Turkey is well placed to tackle, though it would require substantial US support. Here, we'd seek to replicate Turkey's actions against ISIS and the YPG north of Aleppo, to create a reality on the ground of steadily expanding ink spots. In Aleppo, those ink spots have since turned into de facto safe zones from which adversaries were defeated, al-Qaeda fled, reconstruction has now begun, refugees are returning, moderate rebel groups are being trained, and police are taking over from armed groups. The opposition interim government now plans to establish offices in this area. Beyond countering terrorism, there is no immediate opening for a nationwide settlement. As such, we should pursue an interim solution, imposing calm to distinct geographic zones. Creating zones of calm along Syria's borders will assist an eventual process of refugee resettlement. It would constrain or even stop the flow of weapons and money intended for armed activities. It would give opposition territories the opportunity to begin governance and service provision free from aerial bombing, and it would allow some level of interim reconstruction to begin. Creating multiple facts on the ground would also represent a considerable source of pressure on Assad and may eventually allow for a meaningful initiation of negotiations. For this reason, the United States would need to pursue an intensive track of bilateral negotiations with Russia throughout the lead up to and as these zones of calm take form. For this reason, America and its allies must be prepared for enforcement. Credible threats of punitive force can create meaningful diplomatic leverage, but only when part of a clearly defined strategy. Finally, this deterrence should encompass more than the use of internationally banned weapons. It is important for us to establish a moral equivalency. Conventional weapons are far more deadly than sarin gas. In fact, Assad's aerial bombing of his own population has killed at least 57 times as many people as the use of chemicals and banned chemical weapons. It should not be a matter of the murder weapon that defines whether murder is acceptable or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Daphne Rand.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. Chairman,
But Dr. Pohl, the microphone close.
Sure.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the white helmets, and I'd like to start there because I agree that it is a remarkable story. I would note that 140 or so of these white helmets, these civilian protection forces, have been directly targeted when they go out to rescue. So there's been 140 casualties in the past 2 years alone. That's just one statistic of the suffering, displacement, and state-led atrocities that have occurred in Syria. There are 80% of the population is now in need of humanitarian assistance. 12 million Syrians are displaced inside and outside the country. In short, this is the greatest humanitarian tragedy and crisis in our current world today. So thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, for making and keeping the Syrian people at the center of your policymaking work here. The strikes on April 6th may have been a justifiable, appropriate response to the use of sarin gas against Khan Sheikhoun. Yet these strikes appear to be divorced from a larger strategy for U.S. engagement. It is particularly alarming that the administration comments on Syria policy after these strikes continue to be so disjointed and unclear. Americans, our allies, and the Syrian people would benefit from understanding what these strikes signify and where they fit within the larger policy goals. I see at least 4 objectives for the U.S. and Syria, and each will require a sustained strategy that combines public and private diplomacy. None of these will succeed without a fully staffed and empowered State Department serving as a co-equal in the interagency, and none of them can be sustained without adequate foreign assistance. First, as my colleagues have mentioned, a negotiated agreement and the de-escalation of the fighting should be the most immediate and most important objective. Fighting ISIS, countering WMD, helping civilians, these goals are very critical, but they will all be enabled by conflict resolution. Because this is the foundational objective, it is alarming to read public statements from the administration flippantly suggesting that whether Assad stays or go is irrelevant. Defining the endgame as a negotiated settlement between the regime and the opposition is the critical first task. Secretary Tillerson will have to use these strikes to leverage, and the leverage they have generated to push Moscow back to a position where it will be able and willing to be a genuine partner. That means holding Moscow accountable, publicly and privately, when ceasefires promised by the regime never materialize, or when aid convoys promised by Damascus and organized by the UN never reach the besieged areas. It is true that pushing Moscow and Tehran to make Damascus concede will be very, very tough, but we have leverage. For example, let's refuse CT cooperation to Moscow if it doesn't comply with the next round of de-escalation or humanitarian talks. Second, defeating ISIS is an obvious priority, but the administration needs to be smart about the diplomacy and foreign assistance that will sustain any military offensive. Pushing Daesh out of Raqqa will be the easy part. What will be hard will be working with Turkey to negotiate YPG influence, as has been mentioned, or to ensure that the SAC, the Syrian Arab Coalition, and the SDF, the combination of Kurdish and Arab liberators, can effectively govern this very vast area of Syria. What we know about global terrorism is this: they prey on ungoverned spaces, remote from central government control, where citizens are disaffected and angry. We cannot let these territories of Syria fall into this trap again. And that's why I'm particularly concerned about rumored and alleged reductions in things like food aid or reductions in support for governance to local councils that will be formed in the wake of the Daesh liberation from these areas of Syria. And because a sustainable defeat of ISIS requires a regional consideration, I'm concerned about reports that ESF to Jordan, to Tunisia, to Lebanon are reportedly going to be cut. Third, the chemical weapons deterrence is a key objective. The strikes may deter Assad from using CW again. We don't really know because he's been using CW as a weapon of desperation. So we need to also continue the really hard multilateral diplomatic work. I would note Russia's relative cooperation with the 2013 UN resolutions on the UN regarding Syria's gas attack, and with generally the 2013 to 2014 UN Organization for the Cooperation Against the Proliferation of Weapons, the OPCW's efforts to destroy 1,300 tons of weapons. Clearly this was imperfect, clearly there was cheating and hidden weapons, but for Syria's neighbors and for the citizens and for US troops on the ground, certainly destroying something was better than nothing. And that's why today multilateral diplomacy is critical. That's why we need to continue to support the OPCW and UN investigatory bodies. And we will need to do this through diplomacy by pushing the Russians and other members of the international community. Fourth, protecting the Syrian people must remain at the heart of U.S. policy in Syria. This effort includes humanitarian assistance, support for civil society, and support for local governance in liberated and opposition-controlled areas, and it includes accountability measures for the ongoing human rights violations and atrocities that have been committed, including accountability for the Khan Sheikhoun attack. Since the start of this conflict, the U.S. has been the largest single bilateral donor of humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people. But in the past months, the aid that is flowing from the U.S. and other donor nations has not been reaching most of the Syrians in need. Some organizations on the ground are estimating that only 10% of international aid is arriving into opposition-controlled areas of Syria. That's over 5 million people. So this crisis of access will require continued American leadership. In conclusion, absent a clear and consistent articulation of U.S. strategy towards Syria, these limited strikes earlier this month will have little to no material impact. In fact, there's a danger that our friends may feel over time even more betrayed, as many within Syria and the region cheered the strikes on the premise that they signaled a significant shift in policy. A clear strategy will help us mobilize our partners. For example, at this particular moment, we need our Gulf partners to help us play a moderating role with the armed opposition. So pushing for the resumption of negotiations will be hard, but a strategy that focuses on diplomacy and U.S. leadership is the only option. Finally, I thank this committee for understanding how a fully funded, empowered State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development will be critical to pursue all of the objectives that I have outlined. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. You know, it seems that Russia and Iran have very different goals here for Syria, and that's some of you have commented on that. And in terms of trying to figure out next steps, it looks as though the goal on the part of the Iranians is sort of a land bridge that would stretch, you know, to Hezbollah-controlled southern Lebanon, where for some time now the Islamic Republic of Iran has been trying to move these larger and larger missiles or longer-range missiles. I guess this morning there's reports that the IDF took out or put a strike in against a shipment that had landed of these missiles, right? So as Iran's obsession with their stated policy of wiping Israel off the map continues, you have Moscow with a very different goal. Their goal is to not wipe out Israel. Their goal seems to be to increase Russia's leverage. And I wonder if that suggests that the two could be split here in terms of the long-term interest of trying to get some stability, because as long as the Iranians remain on the ground, the problem there is going to be that the recruitment and training for additional Hezbollah units that you're now seeing, as well as the in-migration of the Revolutionary Guard Corps on the ground and these other entities, they're not seeking to calm that situation. I mean, all across the Middle East, they're creating additional, whether it's Yemen or Bahrain, they're involved in conflict. And I would just ask our panelists for their opinion on a strategy that would allow some kind of a direct negotiation on that concept, and whether you think it would be possible, because that might allow us then to move Assad out of the equation and bring in someone else on the Alawite side that would have an interest in the long-term survivability of Syria as a state. Mr. Singh.
Sure. Well, Mr. Chairman, I think you're absolutely right about differing Russian and Iranian interests, as I mentioned in my testimony. I think the challenge is that in the short term, I think there's a sort of codependency between Russia and Iran and Syria. They need each other. Russia is providing actually quite a small military force, but a decisive one, providing air cover, for example, for the ground forces, which are largely provided by the Iranians. The Iranians have contributed For the numbers I've seen, upwards of 100,000 fighters, not Iranians all, but Iranian-backed fighters. And so there's a sort of complementarity to Russian and Iranian activities there, and I think either would be hard-pressed to succeed without the other. But I do think that Iran is committed to the Assad regime in a way that perhaps over the long run Russia isn't, because I think that Iran could not be guaranteed its position in Syria with any ruler other than Bashar al-Assad, even if it were someone else from his sect or someone else from his sort of territory. And that does, over the long run, perhaps open up the possibility of splitting the two. But I think it is very much over the long run. I think it's not something that's there in the short term. Perhaps the Russians will come to see that they're embroiled in a counterinsurgency that there's very sort of little easy escape from. No one is going to come and rescue the Russians from the insurgency which they're facing around Idlib and Aleppo and so on and so forth. We're certainly not going to. We certainly shouldn't. And I don't think anyone else is prepared to do so either, and hopefully that will prompt the Russians at some point to recognize, especially if there is a credible threat of American military force.
Well, maybe Mr. Lister can comment on this, but it seems to me the Russian objective here is partly to maintain access to the Mediterranean. Their goal is not necessarily to see this thing deepen, and yet for the Iranians, they're gaining battlefield experience for their forces. They're honing their skills. They're replacing Sunni populations with Lebanese Hezbollah families that they're bringing in to old Damascus and areas like this. This is the exact opposite, it would seem to me, of Russia's long-term interest. And so, Mr. Lister, what's your observation?
Thank you for the question. For me, this is essentially about differing goals and differing means between Iran and Russia. These are two countries playing extremely different, but as my colleague says, complementary roles in Syria. For Russia, the objective is to compete and outplay the United States and to show that we aren't the power that we think we are, that we're not capable of exerting the kind of influence in the region that we used to. And also, of course, immediately to shore up what was in 2011 Russia's most reliable and most intensive relationship in the region, which was the Assad regime. Since the Soviet Union times, Russia has relied on the Syrian army intensively for a relationship in the region, almost exclusively. And so for Russia, this is a strategic or geostrategic calculus, largely as a reflection of its rivalry with the United States. And for Iran, this is a zero-sum issue. There is, as of now, in today's dynamics, no negotiation for Iran. It's Assad or nothing, or we carry on fighting. And the key issue, the key worry we should all have in our minds is that we've invested so much energy over the last 2 or 3 years based on an assumption that Russia has the leverage necessary to result in the kind of policy result that we want, which is a negotiation process that means something, that results in a conclusion that we all want, which is an end to conflict and some extent of political transition in Damascus. Unfortunately, as my colleague said, Russia is actually operating in Syria with on a shoestring, with very little ground influence beyond special forces dotted around in a few specific areas. You know, I've spent the last 18 months meeting periodically with Russian officials who work on the Syrian issue. And one of the things they revealed to me, which was very interesting, is that as of 2 or 3 months ago, the assessment within Moscow was that the Syrian army had no more than 20,000 offensively deployable, sufficiently trained and loyal soldiers that the Russian government was willing to work alongside. 20,000 for all of Syria. It's a pittance. In comparison, the Iranian government has successfully established what I would estimate to be at least 150,000 militiamen. Syrians, predominantly, but also Iraqis, Lebanese, Syrians, Afghans, Pakistanis, and possibly some Yemenis. 20,000 forces, Syrian forces, as compared to 150,000 militiamen who are there potentially to die for a religious cause rather than for a strategic cause, is an issue we need to worry about in terms of how we invest our resources, in terms of pushing or things to create the possible conditions for the result that we want.
Thank you. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my questions, I ask unanimous consent to enter two statements into the record. One is a statement by Rayed al-Salah, head of the Syria Defense, as you mentioned before, known as the White Helmets, on behalf of Nobel Peace Prize nominated rescue organization that's rescued over 90,000 Syrian lives.
Without objection.
And the second statement is from Church World Service.
Again, without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said in a press briefing shortly after the U.S. airstrikes, "If you gas a baby, if you put a barrel bomb into innocent people, I think you will see a response from this president." This appeared to add a new red line to U.S. policy that Assad's use of barrel bombs, an all too frequent occurrence, would invite a U.S. response. But later the White House clarified that he meant chlorine-filled barrel bombs. Now, for anyone who thinks that I'm going tough on the White House, they should know that I was equally tough on the previous administration. Miscalculation that Assad would somehow fall, and so cause them to do things or not do things. And of course, here we are many years later, Assad hasn't fallen. I think we made a terrible mistake when we didn't aid the Free Syria Army 4 years ago, when the president's team, national security team, all was in favor of it. I think there was a miscalculation. I also think when you draw lines in the sand, you need to back up those lines. But you also need to be consistent. And what we're seeing from the administration is the introduction and retraction of new red lines. It muddies U.S. strategy on Syria. And as I mentioned before, I think it's very important that the President tell the Congress what his plans are in Syria, and then the Congress needs to give him authorization to make any kind of military moves. So when we have introduction and retraction of new red lines, it muddies the strategy on Syria. I want to ask Dr. Rand, how do we expect our allies and adversaries to react to this?
Thank you, Congressman Engel. This is a deep concern of mine as well, that the inconsistency is sending different signals and that our allies will see in the administration and White House's different statements what they want to hear, right? So certain allies have different views and they will seize on one secretary or another secretary's statements if they diverge to say that is U.S. administration policy. That is a concern. On the issue of what is the red line, is it just a CW deterrence or is it a general deterrence about crimes against humanity? I would note that in the couple days after the sarin gas attacks, there was very damaging atrocities committed by the Syrian regime again. So if that indeed was Mr. Spicer's red line, it was passed already shortly at the time he was making those statements. But I would agree with the concern about allies. I would also add the concern about the Syrian people who are left confused about what is the new shift in U.S. policy toward intervention.
Anybody else care to comment?
Well, Congressman, I would agree with the general principle that credibility is important, and I think to have credibility, we also need to have clarity. I agree with that, and that's why it's important that we have a very rigorous policy process where we decide what are those lines for the United States that sort of both threaten our interests, threaten civilians on the ground. What are we prepared to do in response? And then that we communicate those things through the appropriate channels. Sometimes a public message is right. Sometimes private messages to places like Moscow and elsewhere are the right methods. But that'll requires a rigorous policy process, and I think that'll be the key for us.
Thank you. Let me ask a question about the chemical weapons program. In 2013, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons certified, we remember this, that it had removed 1,300 tons of declared chemical weapons from Syria. And of course, we now know that Syria held back some chemical agents from declaration and removal because it used those agents in the April 4th sarin gas attack. Now, I supported the U.S. response, as I said before, 59 Tomahawk missiles, because I thought it was an appropriate demonstration to Syria and their Russian enablers that there would be consequences for the use of chemical weapons. But these strikes are not a long-term solution, and they will not help to eliminate the threat posed by Syria's continued possession of chemical weapons. So let me ask any of the witnesses, what recommendations do you have to work toward full implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 2118, which sought to remove Syria's chemical weapons, and what particular responsibility does Moscow have in the implementation of this resolution and in removing chemical weapons from Syria? Anyone who cares to answer?
Sure, I'll start. I think this is an excellent point, and I mentioned it in my testimony. There's a JIM, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, that was commissioned by the UN in 2015 to go and actually name perpetrators in some of the chemical weapons. And this mandate was extended last year to 2017, so it will run out, I think, sometime this summer or the fall. So it's really critical. This is an urgent diplomatic, again, this is not a sufficient diplomatic solution to the CW chemical weapons problem, but it's part of the solution, and it's urgent that the U.S. show its leadership at the UN and push Moscow and other powers to agree to continue this mandate of the JIM.
I would add, if I may, frankly speaking, Russia bears the weight of responsibility for the fact that this chemical weapons attack took place. And we shouldn't forget that Russia had troops and almost certainly aircraft up until a certain time at this airbase from which the attack was launched. We should all be asking the question, and I'm sure we all are, did Russia in fact know that the Assad regime had retained some extent of its chemical weapons capabilities? And if it did, then we would be justified in, I think, putting and placing more pressure, whether through escalation, whether through sanctions or other diplomatic means, on the Russian government to force it to see through a broader package of policies on Syria, the more holistic one that I described in my opening statement, that in the end, Russia isn't going to achieve its ultimate objective in Syria, which is stability. For Russia, Syria is still something to be negotiated over. And I think what the Russians are discovering, almost on a week-by-week basis now, is that having invested resources in Syria and in rescuing the Assad regime, achieving that ultimate long-term objective isn't happening, and it's not going to happen for a long time. So I do think we have a responsibility to put more pressure on Russia. And more broadly, I think the sanctions on, 271 Syrians connected to the chemical weapons program is a good step. I noted that a number of that size suggests that we're not just targeting senior officials, but we're also targeting people further down the ladder of seniority, and I think that's wise. I think using what I would term escalatory sanctions, starting from the ground level and moving up, is an excellent way of putting more pressure and a sense of paranoia within the regime's military, intelligence, and otherwise the regime's apparatus, that we know what they're doing, we know who they are, we know everything about them, and they will face consequences for being involved in these kind of criminal acts. And I think there is a lot that we can do to add to that pressure further.
If I could just make a brief point, Congressman. I want to make sure that there's a clear understanding that this is not just a humanitarian issue for the United States, because the CWC is a non-proliferation treaty. And if we allow that non-proliferation treaty to be breached, I think that has strategic ramifications for the United States, for non-proliferation broadly. So we need to keep that frame of reference in mind as well.
Thank you.
Okay, we go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And while Congress must be consulted before any long-term escalation of force in Syria, I supported the missile strikes that took place earlier this month, and I hope that they serve as a warning that the United States will no longer tolerate Assad's chemical weapons attacks against innocent civilians. The missile strikes proved our willingness to use force. That's a necessary ingredient whose absence doomed any previous chance of a negotiated outcome in Syria. But I'm still very concerned about the lack of a comprehensive strategy in Syria, a problem that has stretched across both administrations, and our seeming insistence on treating the symptoms rather than the disease. And as so many of us have said over the years, it is not possible to defeat ISIS while Assad remains in power. I fear that our narrow focus on short-term tactical successes will only exacerbate the problems that we're trying to solve. So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Lister, can we hope to defeat ISIS while Assad remains in power? A lot of you spoke about what would happen if, and how does Assad's presence and tactics contribute to the growth and the narrative appeal of ISIS, as well as the al-Qaeda-linked and other jihadist groups in Syria? And if Assad is not removed by countering Iran, by finding leverage with Russia or otherwise, is it possible for this conflict and its associated costs to come to an end?
Thank you very much for a really excellent question. And I think to answer it, we need to consider context as well, some historical background, but I'll stay in the immediate term for now. The reason why we've had success against ISIS, or one of the reasons why we've had success with little other negative knock-on effects up until now, is because ISIS purposefully detached itself from the other dynamics of the Syrian conflict. With the exception of about a 6-month period of time, ISIS never sought to work with the opposition. It never sought to become part of the revolution against the Assad regime. It explicitly sought to establish an Islamic State with or without help, and it would kill anyone who got in its way. And for that reason, we've been able to attack ISIS in isolation from the rest of the conflict with relative success up until now. But I think, as I hope is becoming clear, we are now seeing some of those disadvantageous knock-on effects becoming clear. For example, our NATO ally Turkey is effectively now at war with our local partner in fighting ISIS as of last night. And all of that is because, as you say, we didn't base all of this on a more holistic strategy. We didn't appreciate enough all of the broader dynamics. So that's today. In terms of Assad staying, I think the most important thing to bear in mind here is some history. In 2003, when the United States prepared to invade Iraq, as, in fact, American troops crossed on day one, the Grand Mufti then in Syria, the state-appointed, Assad-appointed Grand Mufti, issued a fatwa in which he declared it religiously obligatory on all Muslims globally to launch resistance movements in Iraq against American troops, using any means necessary. And that order was given to men and women. And that was essentially an instruction from the Assad government. Within 11 days of the US invasion of Iraq, 5,000 foreign jihadi fighters crossed into Iraq, crossed Syria's borders. They flew into Aleppo and Damascus airports, were bussed in government buses to the Iraqi border, and waved through open border crossings. And in the 7 or 8 years that followed during the war in Iraq, it would not be an exaggeration, I think, to say that hundreds of American troops would still be alive if the Assad regime had not continued its assistance to ISIS, ISIS's predecessor movement, the Islamic State in Iraq. ISIS wouldn't be what it was today if those foreign jihadi fighters hadn't been given a free hand to train in Syria, to use Syrian government medical facilities, and then to cross Syria's borders into Iraq. And that support for jihadists didn't stop when American troops left Iraq in 2010. In 2011, whilst the Assad regime was arresting pro-democracy protesters and women and children, it was releasing jihadists from prison. 2 of the 7 founding members of the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria were released from prison at the beginning of the protests. At least 10, as far as I'm aware, of ISIS's most senior leaders in Syria were released from Assad prisons under an amnesty in 2011. And since then, it's common knowledge that, at the very least, trade in gas, trade in other resources, has continued between the Assad regime. In fact, this very government here has sanctioned several Syrian officials for facilitating those trades. So the argument is right. I know I'm taking some time, but the argument is right to say that while Assad stays in power, there is very little chance that that kind of facilitation of jihadists for Syrian goals, for Assad regime reasons, will not continue. And most importantly, the narrative for their very existence will continue to exist.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Greg Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank all 3 of the witnesses. I think you have been absolutely excellent and very insightful, and I really appreciate your testimony. Let me start by stating declaratively, and I think that any rational and reasonable person would strongly, as I do, condemn the atrocities that took place in Syria and the utilization of chemical weapons, but I believe just overall, because as one of the witnesses testified, people are dying, whether it's by chemical weapons or by conventional weapons. Death is death, and they're dying by the numbers, and we've got to make sure that we get a handle on that, and that we must, and the whole international community must put our best efforts into addressing the crises there. That's been what my position has been since the start of the conflict, and it remains so today. That being said, many of my colleagues here, and as you've indicated, I think each and every one of you have indicated your thoughts on what should be next. I wish that the President of the United States would also tell us, as members of Congress, what should be or what the strategy is next. You know, we cannot be left wondering after the launch of 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles what Congress is to do. Congress should never be left wondering what next after the use of military force, and never, especially in a situation where there is no imminent threat to our homeland. The United States needs to, and why is that? Because the president has we have a constitution, and the president should abide by that constitution. And so there should be, the president should get congressional authorization for military action. And as I sit here, I'm extremely uneasy that we have no updated AUMF. And the president has stated, basically, that he has acted impulsively without clearly articulating a strategy on Syria. Why do I know that? Because the president said he happened to have seen a picture of babies, and that made him decide to do something that he had said just a few weeks before that he wasn't going to do. So he just acted impulsively without a real strategy as to what to do next. And when we talk about drawing red lines, and I felt this also, when President Obama had the red line, he came to Congress. Congress punted on what to do in Syria. So I would hope, as we looked and asked President Trump to come to Congress, that, and I hope he does, that we don't punt. We listen to the issues. Let's take the responsibility ourselves. The most difficult decision for me, and I've been here for 19 years, the most difficult votes that I've had to make is the vote to make the determination of whether or not we were going to authorize the use of force, whether it was in the Kosovo struggles in the Balkans when President Clinton was there, whether it was Iraq and Afghanistan. And I want, and I think my constituents expect me to have a vote on that regards, and we must make sure that we have that. We cannot have or shirk our responsibility as members of Congress. And so I don't want to then say we can, whether it's President Trump or any other president after him, to say, well, we punted as members of Congress, and then we criticize what the president did do or didn't do thereafter. Let us, we should do our jobs. Clearly, as I said, and someone mentioned Iraq, I think Mr. Lister did, clearly shock and awe, and many of us came back, many members of Congress came back after the shock and awe, and we thought it was all over. We had won. It was victory. And then we saw that there was no strategy thereafter. Let us have learned from that lesson that we can't just be so high and happy because we've had there was a strike, 59 missiles, and it seems to be sending a message that it's over, we did the right thing. Let's talk now. Let's learn from what we didn't do in the past and talk a strategy and work with our allies. I think that Dr. Rand talked about how important it is to make sure we're having a dialogue and a conversation with our allies, as well as to make sure that we're doing what's on the ground. We were just talking about the fact that I think Mr. Lister was talking about how, in fact, during the war, the Syrian government was still active in putting folks in and trying to turn around the minds of individuals on the ground. Well, here, and Dr. Rand was absolutely correct, if we're cutting all humanitarian aid, if we're not putting in place things on the ground, if we're refusing to let refugees into the United States, we are not then doing what we need to do to make sure that even the folks on the ground, to keep ISIS, or Daesh as I call them, from recruiting individuals on the ground thinking that we're the bad guys. So I really had a question, but I'm out of time. I was just so impressed with your testimony and with the way that you have been answering questions. I think, Mr. Chairman, maybe this is the youngest panel we've had. We need to make sure we have more young people whose future is really on the line. They are really thinking about tomorrow because it's there today. And so this is on both sides. All the witnesses, you and Mr. Engel, should be really complimented about the witnesses that you brought here today.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. We now go to Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, and I would like to echo what Mr. Meeks just said about the value of the testimony today. What's interesting is that you sort of dumped a heap of facts onto us, and you're trying to make some sense out of it, like some sort of a jigsaw puzzle. And here you are, you've studied this, and you spend your whole time studying, and you can't come up with what the jigsaw maps out of this quagmire is. And so we appreciate you letting us know the series of facts that we need to deal with, and maybe we can work together and come up with some ideas. I was heartened that our chairman, Mr. Royce, who I have deep respect for, during his questions mentioned how we might really benefit negotiating with Russia on this issue. And
Well, I didn't get to the second part of my question. We would replace Putin as well as Assad for the negotiating. Just wanted to clarify, Mr. Rohrbacher. Thank you.
so, what we heard today is that there was a civil war in Syria, an organized effort supported by outsiders to overthrow the government of Assad. That civil war, where people came in to support that, has now morphed into a regional anarchy, basically. And let me just say that I don't believe that Assad was any more brutal, any more dictatorial than a number of our friends and allies in that region. If there was a civil war being financed against any number of those governments, they would wipe out their opponents, and I do believe there is a moral equivalency between dropping a bomb on people and killing those same people with the gas. You're killing innocent people. We have to stop killing and seeing that there's killing of innocent people. And obviously, when we bomb, we end up bombing their air base because 85 civilians suffered gas effects from gas and died. At the same time, where we are engaged in bombing in other parts nearby, and our bombs are killing 10 times or 5 times that number of civilians. No, this killing should stop. That should be our goal, and we should be willing to work with Russia in order to try to find some overall regional solution now. And it shouldn't just be Assad has to go. Let me just suggest what Erdogan is doing now, especially in his latest attacks. Erdogan is doing more damage to our national security by his basically power grab inside his own country and his Islamicization of his own country. He's doing much more damage than Assad could ever have dreamed of doing to our security. And yet, we're going to continue giving support to Mr. Erdogan, even after this incredible power grab that he has just participated in, a corrupt election that gives him the power to move that country. And now we find he's actually attacking Kurds now, rather than just trying to working with us in some ways. Here's the question, and all these facts that you're talking about, and again, I deeply appreciate the facts that you have given us today to consider. Do we now need, if we are going to have peace in that region, a regional type of grand meeting somewhere, like they did after World War I, and redraw the borders and have newly accepted areas where the Kurds could have their area and you could have various recognition, rather than trying to have a situation where today it obviously isn't working, and we obviously have a double standard for Assad and Russia than we do for our own friends. So let me put that out on the table.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think that the way I would interpret what's happened here in Syria is that is maybe a little bit different, in the sense that I see in 2011 a peaceful protest that was brutally suppressed by the Assad regime. And
do you think any of our allies, the Saudis, the Qatarians, the Kuwaitis, if they thought that there was a civil war being financed by some other country in their region, would not have been just as brutal as Assad was?
Well, so I don't think that was what happened here. I think this was actually, as I said, peaceful protests by Syrians that were suppressed by the Syrian regime. And I think that the Syrian regime created the conditions for the rise of an extremist opposition that, as Charles has pointed out, was a useful
But you're talking
foil
about an
for the regime.
evolution, because if you have a peace, what happens is, we've seen it over and over again. Peaceful demonstrations, you got a dictator, a gangster, he slaughters innocent people, and then all of a sudden it escalates. That happened, it's happened a dozen times.
Well, this is on a very different scale, Congressman, than anything that's happened in the region, as I think Dr. Rand pointed out, because you have hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of people displaced, and I think what we really need is now to show leadership, which we didn't show in the past, to get on the same page of our allies to try to resolve the situation where we haven't in the past.
Okay.
We need to go to Mr. Bill Keating of Massachusetts.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member, because this committee, since I've been involved in it for several years now, has been thoughtful and substantive in its actions and instrumental in many of our policies. And along those lines, I want to just mention that as valuable as the testimony is today, I want to see going forward, I see a pattern on these issues where we're not having Trump administration officials in front of this committee. And I think that's important to flesh out the strategy itself.
It's a good point, and if the gentleman would yield for a moment.
They haven't been
Mr.
appointed
Engel and I have had the opportunity to speak to Secretary of State, and we're extending an invitation to the committee.
I am not surprised. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
Mr. Keating.
And I just want to comment, too, that that'll help flesh out a strategy. And that's what we're talking about here. You know, today's testimony and the brutal conflict itself has proven that ending these atrocities and reaching a resolution requires a strategy that reflects the complexities on the ground and cooperation at the international level. And I think a one-off military strike, which I thought was appropriate, yet one that wasn't followed up with a plan, and the inadequate staffing in the State Department to meaningfully engage, and also budget proposals that undermine our ability to be strategic are all issues. Now, I also want to concentrate on something I have that I struggle with, and I think has been brought up in today's testimony, and that's the fact that Mr. Lister in particular started along these lines. On one sense, we're getting testimony and a general feeling among people looking at this issue that, you know, Assad is such a problem, we can't have a final resolution with his maintenance of power. Yet, we're also saying we need Russia to perform such a meaningful role in dealing with the resolution. And Mr. Lister started along an area I wanted to pursue when he said, you know, Russians were at that air base before the chemical weapons attack. And there were outsourced and unofficial reports that Russian-controlled drones were going over the hospital prior to the attack, doing intelligence and reconnaissance. For what purpose? Ahead of time. And how complicit is Russia, not just in their ignoring their responsibilities under the treaty that was negotiated in 2013, but complicit in some of these actions? As Dr. Rand said, it doesn't matter how people are killed. They were complicit in, I think, just the slaughter of civilians in their bombing and their military tactics, the same way working side by side with Assad. So how can Russia be so pivotal, in one sense, to what we're doing if they were complicit with Assad, and Assad complicates this? If you can dwell into that, I know it's a difficult question, but I appreciate all your thoughts on this.
If I may, it's an excellent question again, and an extremely important one. This is the meaty, horrible side of politics. Russia is our direct adversary in terms of Syria policy, and yet it is also part of the solution. It will have to be part of the solution. If it's not part of the solution, we won't get a solution. The reason why I single out Russia as being part of that is largely because, as I said earlier, for Russia, Syria is something to be negotiated over. For Iran, this is zero-sum. There is nothing to negotiate. So our only opening here is to convince the Russians that their current path of action is unsustainable, and it won't lead to the eventual objective that they want, which is ultimately, ideally, for Assad to still be in Damascus and in control of 100% of his territory. It's not going to happen. We also need to bear in mind, in terms of your complicity question, Russia has a very different military philosophy. We saw in, I believe, the 1990s, its operations in Grozny and Chechnya. The idea of fighting terrorism for Russia was scorched earth. Yeah. And this is precisely what Russia has further emboldened Assad's scorched earth policy. This is why I described the Syrian army as a result of Soviet...
And my time is running out, but I think it's important to distinguish as well. There's such a perception, I think, in our country that Russia's our ally targeting ISIS. And frankly, that's not the case there. Could you just maybe throw some of your knowledge that you have in this area towards at least breaking up that myth to a degree?
Sure. Well, I'd be lying to say that Russia hasn't fought ISIS, but I would be telling the truth to say it's far from their first priority. Russia has pivoted on different priorities over time. When it has successfully negotiated with the international community to enforce a ceasefire between the opposition and the regime, it has then celebrated the success of having established a ceasefire, and then, with all of the world's media watching, pivoted to fight ISIS for a couple weeks.
Okay. Well, thank you. My time is up, but I would yield back. But thank you for shedding some light on this.
We go to Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very grateful for the leadership today of Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Elliott Engel to hold a hearing as we discuss the long-term stability of not just Syria but the Middle East as a whole. And I'm really pleased, too, how bipartisan this is. Indeed, I'm happy to join with Congressman Greg Meeks to point out that we have a very insightful panel, and I wish you well in your careers. More than 500,000 people have been killed and 14 million driven from their homes as a result of the unending conflict. This gruesomely sad situation should have been dealt with earlier, and I'm disheartened it's taken until a few weeks ago where action was taken against Assad after he conducted another chemical weapons attack, committing mass murder against his own people. We find ourselves in a difficult situation today as we have let Russia and Iran take an unnecessarily active role in shaping Syria's future. More should be done in Syria, and more will be done, and I want to thank all of you for the testimony today. And for each of you, how do you assess the humanitarian crisis in Syria and the neighboring nations resolving itself? I'm actually trying to be positive. When we talk about a stable and prosperous Syria after the missile strikes, what would you say are the most important milestones to achieve in order to incentivize millions of displaced Syrians to come home, beginning with Mr. Singh?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Thank you for your kind words. It's a difficult question because I think we're actually quite far away from, and I appreciate you trying to be optimistic, but I think we're actually quite far away from any such milestones. I do want to reiterate that while we talk quite a bit about Assad and Russia and Iran, and appropriately so, again, I think we need to bear in mind that this conflict is no longer sort of a single conflict, and those actors, which are, I think, malign actors, are largely active in western Syria. And so you have these other quadrants of the conflict in which, for example, we wouldn't want to invite Assad and the Russians and the Iranians to have influence over the liberation of Raqqa and what's happening in eastern Syria. I think what we need to do is to look at each of these quadrants separately, do what we can to stabilize each of them and to empower local actors. And in doing so, perhaps return some semblance of stability to them, at least in the short term, preventing them from getting worse. So as I look at southern Syria, for example, the Jordanians worry that renewed fighting in southern Syria, close to their border, where there is now an ISIS branch that has been established, could result in more refugee flows across their border. And as I said, they're already hosting up to upwards of 1 million refugees, which is a big strain. So at least preventing that from getting worse, I think, will be quite important. Once we have achieved some measure of stability in one or more of those quadrants, then I think over the longer term you can think about how do you knit this back together. But I think the reality is, for the foreseeable future, you're not going to see Syria reunified. There's no single actor that has that capability, and we shouldn't pursue that goal first and foremost. It should be stability in these zones.
Very briefly, I would say I would refer you to my full written testimony in which I do try to suggest at least, and as I said in my opening comments, that there are interim things that we can do which I think can alleviate some of the very dire humanitarian situation. And there are things we can do with relatively minimal effort, although increased investment from where we currently stand, to allow refugees to come back into Syria, to allow interim reconstruction to begin. And all of that compiled together results in some indirect pressure on the Assad regime to consider negotiations in a serious way. And I would encourage you to look, although it's far from perfect, and certainly Turkey has problems in terms of being our ally at the moment, I would refer you to look at what was done in northern Aleppo and how effective on a humanitarian level that is now becoming. I would say 40,000 refugees have returned to that area now, which is effectively a safe zone in the last 4 to 6 weeks or so. And that gives us a signal of what's possible.
Thank you, Congressman. I would agree completely with my colleagues and just add 2 more very important points. One, I think I mentioned earlier this access issue. There are 5 million or so Syrians living under opposition control or sort of non-regime control that are being denied access, it seems, to some of the humanitarian aid that even we're paying for. So the access issue through the cross-border, through Turkey, that's a key issue. That's a diplomatic issue. It's pushing our partners and pushing the Russians to help get this aid into Idlib province and other provinces under the opposition control. So that would be point number 1, is the access. And second, to go back to the very good questions from your colleague from Massachusetts, you know, the Russians are playing not only a scorched earth policy, but their tactics, their air war tactics, are driving civilians from Syria in rapid numbers. And so they turn it on and off, and they divert, as Mr. Lister said, to the ISIS fight for moments, and then they go back to targeting. But just in this month, I believe, the Russians have increased their targeting against civilians in Idlib, Homs, and other places, and that really drives the refugee crisis because they're targeting hospitals, they're targeting civilian infrastructure sites, and that's what's making people leave their homes when they're feeling unsafe.
Thank you, each of you.
Dr. Ami Bera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to expand on something that my colleague, Mr. Keating, touched on. You know, none of us questions the measured response in response to the use of chemical weapons. But at this juncture, you know, we're given a task as members of Congress to start thinking about what next. And we can't do that without, none of you speak on behalf of the administration. You're providing your opinion. And let me just put that in context. When President Obama was asking Congress to take actions, we had a hearing in this very committee in September of 2013. And again, no disrespect to the panel, but we had Secretary of Defense Hagel, we had Secretary of State Kerry, and we had the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dempsey, and we were able to ask those questions. So, you know, let me remind the President that he doesn't have the authorization to take additional actions against Assad without consultation of Congress. And I know both the Chairman and Ranking Member are doing their best to get those individuals from the administration in front of this committee, but the President needs to understand that separation of powers, and it is incredibly important. You know, again, the measured response, you know, is supported broadly by bipartisan members here. But in isolation, that response of Tomahawk missiles doesn't accomplish anything. It's the what next. And I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses. I think you're providing valuable insight and opinion, but we need the administration here so we can ask directly what their strategy is. And you know, thus far, the President hasn't stated what the what next strategy is. And that is of real concern. You know, Dr. Rand, you touched on something, and I think all of you would agree. When we think about our foreign policy, there's really 3 pillars here. There's certainly the defense, but then there's the diplomacy and the development aspects of foreign policy. And when we think about staffing levels at the State Department, I am incredibly worried about our readiness for, you know, the second and third pillars of whatever the what next strategy is. Dr. Rand, do you want to touch on you know, the lack of staffing at State and the vulnerability and you know, our readiness here?
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Congressman, for that question. First, I should say that there are many, many dedicated career civil servants and foreign service officers in the majority of the State Department and USAID who are there working day in and day out on this issue in particular, and I applaud their consistent contribution to this issue because it's a really tough tragedy to work on. But yes, that is a concern. The way the State Department works is that the political appointees who sit at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level interact with their Department of Defense colleagues to ensure that the 3 Ds are actually working, that development, defense, and diplomacy work synergetically together comprehensively. If you don't have those level of appointees or those levels of leaders to go to the meetings and to work with the military, you are inherently going to erode the contributions of the civilian levers of U.S. foreign policy.
Great. Would either one of you want to comment?
I just want to say one thing on this. I had spent some time myself at the State Department. I was a special assistant to Secretaries Powell and Royce. And I think that I agree with Dr. Rand on the principle that we need to get the State Department staffed up. We need to staff our diplomacy. I'm concerned about some of the reports of big cuts to the State Department budget. On the other hand, it's also important that we have the right organization at the State Department. And as I understand it, that's one of the things that Secretary Tillerson is looking at, because I think one lesson that I would take from the last administration is that we have to be careful that we have a unified Middle East strategy and that we empower our officials to look not just at one slice of the salami, as it were, but that we empower them to look at the entire region. So I'd like to, for example, see an Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs who actually has the power to look at multiple issues across the region and sort of integrate them into a single strategy. And I'll also say my impression is, without minimizing your concerns, Congressman, that inside, for example, the National Security Council, the Trump administration is looking very carefully at this issue and at what our strategy in Syria should be.
And again, I would just reiterate, that may be taking place, but there's a role for Congress, and there's a role for that consultation with Congress. That's how our government's set up. And let me just close with, not to minimize, we've got great government employees, we've got great employees at state, DOD, et cetera, that are doing a tremendous job. So again, I would just urge the administration to respect this committee. And I'll yield back.
We go to Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we've got a great panel. You guys are very well versed in the topic. I just want to point out that we may have had some people from the administration here to testify had some of the administration's appointments not been slow to be confirmed on the Senate side due to obstruction over there, and that's unfortunate because this is a very timely issue. I want to speak on behalf of my constituents because I get a lot of messages to my office, Facebook, Twitter, other things that say this. What are U.S. national security interests that are at stake in Syria, and how do these Syria-specific interests relate to broader U.S. regional or global interest? What are we doing in Syria? Why is it important to the United States? And I'll start with Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Congressman, and it's a great question, and I think your constituents are absolutely right to ask that, as we should have every foreign policy issue. I think we have several interests at stake here. Number one is counterterrorism, first and foremost, because obviously we are focused on defeating ISIS and trying to do it in a way which is sustainable so that ISIS doesn't come back, and I think that's something that ordinary Americans are concerned about. Second, we don't want to see Iran increase its power or increase its ability to project power, whether against our interests or against our allies, like Israel and Jordan. And one thing that we've seen, as others have discussed, is that Iran is in fact attempting to do that. There's also an element here where we have Russia trying to thwart American interests, American objectives in this region, and project its own power globally. And then just finally...
So let me just ask you, I mean, we tried that in Vietnam. How is this going to be different when we try to thwart another country like Russia's engagement in a certain region of the world? Can you touch on that?
Well, I don't know that we are aiming to thwart Russia's engagement in this region of the world. As my colleague mentioned, Russia has had influence in Syria for a long time. I think it's actually the reverse. I think Russia is trying to, in principle, prevent the United States from succeeding in this region. And that's a big concern, I think, for any policymaker, whatever your view of what our relationship with Russia should be in the long run. And I just add one more thing, which is obviously we've seen this conflict cause tremendous instability in Europe. And instability in Europe is, I think, also a concern of the United States.
Any of you others want to comment on that?
I don't want to repeat what my colleague has said, but I would want to reiterate the obvious is that, of course, counterterrorism is an interest. We've focused almost explicitly on ISIS for the last several years, but we seem to have forgotten al-Qaeda. And that, for me, in my area of work, is a very significant concern, and we can come to that perhaps with further questions. The issue of international norms and American credibility is also at stake. I could speak at length at how American credibility has been severely damaged with regards to our treatment of the Syrian crisis over the last 6 years. And there are things, as my remarks said, that we can do to rescue some of that credibility. Iran and Hezbollah are increasing like we've never seen them before. Hezbollah is now arguably more powerful than some Eastern European militaries.
It's interesting that you mentioned that several times today about Iran and Hezbollah. Do you believe that Iran is emboldened based on the Iranian deal that gave them $400 billion plus that they could use to export terrorism, to finance Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations? They feel more emboldened because they got the financial ability now from that deal?
It's hard to say with certainty, although I'd find it hard to believe they didn't find themselves feeling more emboldened. I think the one key difference I can tell after the JCPOA in terms of Iran's strategy in Syria is that they have managed to train these Shia militiamen from all across the region far more intensively and far more professionally than they were before. Whereas we saw 2 or 3 years ago tens of thousands compiled of Afghan Hazara Shia militiamen essentially being cannon fodder in strategic areas, they are now highly capable forces. And that can only have been the result of increased funding, logistical support, training facilities, and of course travel across the region.
Right. I know Dr. Rand wants to get in here, and I've got 30 seconds, but let me just make a point and ask Dr. Rand, do you think if the United States hadn't pulled out of Iraq prematurely without leaving a contingency there, things would be different in western Iraq and Syria?
Thank you, Congressman. No, the Iraq point is a very good one, and I actually would disagree slightly that the Shiite militia training, the cause and effect of that probably predates earlier JCPOA. It probably goes back many, many years, and you could date it even to 2006, 2007 when these Shiite militias were forming. So I don't think it's the 2011, 2010 period that we're talking about. I think we're talking, if you want to cite Iraq as a causal variable that led to the growth of the Shiite militia movement and their ability to train and seize power, I would go even earlier to 2005, 2006, 2007.
Yeah. My time's up. Mr. Chairman, I reiterate, it'd be nice to have some administration officials here, wouldn't it?
Very good. Dina Titus of Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm afraid I'm going to be saying the same thing that most of my colleagues have said because I share their sentiments. I think the meandering policies of the Trump administration have done nothing to end the civil war in Syria. And we all agree it's a complicated situation, and that's why we need a clear strategy with focused execution and leadership, and that's not what we have. The only thing this administration has been clear about is that Assad apparently gets to stay in power, and he's the person who's been willing to kill more than 500,000 of his own people. We haven't received any details about how the president wants to work with others in the area. We haven't seen his super secret plan to get rid of ISIS. All we've seen is some messages, so-called messages that have been sent to Iran and North Korea, and we've had the mother of all bombs drop. We've had the armada going somewhere, we don't know where. We've had saber rattling that has upset some of our closest allies. It seems to be kind of mass confusion. And it's very unpredictable, which means it's unstable and can lead to mistakes. And meantime, the State Department's kind of been sidelined in the whole process of forming any kind of cohesive foreign policy strategy. I will agree with Mr. Keating, Dr. Barra, Mr. Duncan. Y'all are wonderful. You are the experts, obviously, but we've had nobody from the administration. Your analysis is interesting to us, but you are think tank people. You are academics. You are former administration folks. You are not who's there now is supposed to be making the decision. I know we're trying to get the secretary here. Maybe we need to get Ivanka here. She's now got her brother whispering that she's the one who suggested they do the bombing, or Jared Kushner, maybe they're the ones who are doing the policy, so maybe we need to bring them in front of us and ask them what's going on. Meantime, I would just ask Dr. Rand, you know, it's been 20 days since we dropped all the missiles on Syria. Now, President Trump all the time has said, I will never forecast what I'm going to do, unlike the previous administration. I'm not going to warn the enemy. Well, they warned Russia, and they hightailed it out of there. Russia warned Syria. They got out of there. They were using the airfield the very next day. Those precious babies that so moved our president when they were hit with the chemical gas are still being killed by barrel bombs or are washing up on shore on Greek islands because they're refugees. What was the effect of that message? What good did it do? Doctor, do you see any effect on the regime of that strike? Would you advise doing more strikes, less strikes? What?
Yeah. Thank you, Congresswoman. 3 weeks later, it's hard to say exactly what the impact was in terms of the civil conflict, in terms of the war against ISIS, in terms of our allies. I think there was a lot of raised hopes and expectations among many allies in many different parts of the world, among the neighbors, had different views, as I said, and they read into the strikes what they want U.S. policy to be, which often conflicts with each other, which is of concern. But no, I didn't see a deterrent effect in terms of slowing down Assad's killing machine nor slowing down Russian support for Assad in the past 3 weeks.
So the message wasn't very clear or wasn't very effective?
No, I don't think that message had that sort of impact.
Mr. Lister?
The message was clear in one single act, but there is no strategy. The only impact I can say that we have seen is that there clearly is still some concern within the Assad regime about the fact that we did conduct the attack because they've redeployed almost all of their aircraft to Russia's military base in the northwest of the country for protection. So clearly the impact of one strike of 59 cruise missiles has made people ask questions about whether or not we'll do it again, but they shouldn't just be asking the questions. It should be clear from our side whether or not there will be or there will not be. So clearly, as I said in my opening remarks, we do need an underpinning strategy to have the proper effect that we want.
All right.
You know, I confess I disagree slightly with my colleagues on this. I think if the narrow purpose of these strikes was to deter the use of chemical weapons and to lend credibility to American military threats, I think that it's possible that they will succeed in that narrow basis. But again, that's narrow. And so I wouldn't be quite as negative about it, perhaps, as you suggest.
I think you say it's possible that it will succeed. What happens if it doesn't deter them and they do it again? That's the big question that looms out there. What next, I guess, is the point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. As is often the case in this committee, I feel like I'm compelled to correct the record by the time it comes to my opportunity to ask some questions. So I'm just going to take some time to remind everybody who says that we must have a strategy and that this side opposes such a thing. Nothing could be further from the truth. We believe that we must have a strategy, and the President must come to us as well for further and continued military action. That having been said, let's just be reminded that he's been in office for about 100 days. Meanwhile, for 8 years prior to this, we still didn't see a strategy, and when we did, well, there was red line, and then I'm going to take some military action, and then when the American people disagree with it, then I'm going to go to the Congress, and then I'm not going to do anything. And if this is complicated, which it is, I would say that whatever the strategy was during the last administration has a lot to do with the complications we're dealing with right now, which includes Russian involvement, which the United States effectively kept out of the Middle East for 60 years under previous policy. Let's not forget that. All right, moving on. Does anybody on the panel believe that Moscow was aware of Assad's use of chemical weapons beforehand and or approved of it beyond its, or was it beyond its control, Russia? Mr. Singh, do you know?
I don't know, but it's hard for me to imagine that Russia and Iran wouldn't be aware of those types of things, given the integration between these militaries.
Mr. Lister.
Just to add briefly, the French government released an investigation into the attack yesterday. They actually deployed assets to the town that was attacked. One of the things they found was that chemical hexamine was used as a mixing agent for sarin. Key thing about hexamine is it takes many, many hours, if not 1 to 2 days, to actually complete the process of forming sarin. It's a binary chemical. Right. There have been media reports here in the United States citing unnamed intelligence officials saying that we had detected people linked to the chemical weapons program going to the Shayrat Air Base in the days preceding the attack. If those reports are true and we indeed did detect those things, there is no way in my mind that Russia, having troops on the base itself, wouldn't know.
Wouldn't know, right? So it would seem that Russia, potentially, at least at this point, could be complicit, and it seems to be pointing in that direction. Dr. Rand, do you have a countervailing opinion?
Well, I agree. I think actually the most guilty behavior was afterwards, when there was a disinformation campaign in the week subsequent where Russia was denying this attack took place in the face of, the hospital reports from Turkey.
Overwhelming evidence.
So that's actually, I don't know the answer to your question, but that was pretty damning.
To what extent can Assad defy Russia? I mean, they're trying to influence. They've got their base there. They want to keep Assad to that extent, but I would agree they're looking for stability that they're not going to get. What kind of leash does he have? Does he have a pretty broad range of authority and where he can still receive compliance from Russia in things like what we just discussed, potentially?
It's an awfully tough question to answer, Congressman. I think that as Charles mentioned, he needs Russia and Iran especially to have any hope of success militarily in the battlefield. At the same time, they need him. There is no Assad regime without Assad.
Right.
So there's a codependency. And exactly what is the dynamic in that relationship, I'd be hard-pressed.
So, but I would think at a minimum, we're hard-pressed to put a whole lot or really any degree of trust in Russia in some kind of bilateral operations or negotiations. We're forced to it because they're at the table, because the last administration essentially allowed them at the table, or they forced themselves to the table. But we can't trust them in anything we're doing. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think that our history of negotiations so far have shown that, as Mr. Lister mentioned, they have a pretty poor track record when it comes to enforcing ceasefires and getting Assad to do what he needs to do.
Just looking further, what would their objectives be in Libya and Egypt? Is this the beginning of further influence in the region?
Well, I think broadly, Russia's trying to reassert itself as a global power. It's trying to reestablish its influence in regions like the Middle East, but not only the Middle East. And look, having a presence there on NATO's southern flank, they obviously have quite a presence on NATO's eastern flank, gives them a bit of influence and leverage over especially those southern NATO countries. So I think that there's a lot of different things in play.
Yeah, so I think we need to be wary of that and aware of that. Regarding future negotiation and stability, and your assertion that it's not going to come anytime soon, and I would agree with you, are there decision points for Russia? And if there are, and I imagine there are, do you have any inclination to what they would be? And finally, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, would you just acknowledge that it was protocol to allow the Russians to know that our missiles indeed were inbound? It was not collaboration or collusion, it's protocol.
It's protocol, and I think it's prudence as well, Frank.
Okay. And the previous question?
Oh, the decision points for Russia. Russia is obviously most active in that western sort of quadrant of the conflict, as well as a bit in the southern quadrant. And it seems right now they're trying to establish control around Idlib. And so I think that seems to be the focus. But I think whether or not that remains the focus, how that goes, will depend also in part on what happens in the rest of the country. I think, for example, a successful operation to liberate Raqqa changes the sort of facts on the ground, because it really, especially if we're starting to empower local actors there, it eliminates the possibility that Assad can somehow regain control of the country and perhaps changes the dynamics for Russia, for Assad, for Iran.
Thank you. We go to Brad Snyder of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for calling this hearing. To the witnesses, your testimony, your written testimony in particular, was extraordinarily helpful. I want to associate myself with my colleagues about the need for a strategy, the need for the administration to be here speaking to us. But also I want to, as maybe starting a trend, set the record straight, because it was indicated that it is obstruction that is slowing down having people in place. And I just want to point out that there have been very few nominations made within the State Department, among other departments. There are 2 upcoming nomination hearings. The Senate is moving quickly. We need the senior officials to be nominated and in place to make sure we implement the strategy we need to have in place. Moving to questions, Mr. Lister, you indicated in your testimony that Assad cannot put Syria back together again. Is that a statement about Assad, or is it more a statement about Syria in general?
I take it to mean the latter part of your question is implying whether partition is possible.
The question is, can Syria be put back together again, or is it something that we are trying to do the impossible?
Fundamentally speaking, a very significant proportion of Syria's population have seen the wrath of the Assad regime. And he uses, so the Assad regime's chief motto is, Assad or we burn the country.
Right.
Assad frequently says he is cleansing his country of the impure. With Assad still in place and with his 4 intelligence apparatuses who have every single piece of information about anyone who could potentially be opposed to his regime, while he stays in power, 6.5 million Syrians will never go.
And I agree that Assad can't. But is it possible to put Syria back together at
I
this
think
point?
so, yes, in the long term. The key thing for everyone to bear in mind is that the only thing, in my experience, that unites the opposition and the regime is an opposition to Syria falling apart. Okay. Both of them oppose partition 100%.
Good. Mr. Singh, turning to you, you talked about Syria being a conflict spread over 4 zones. And as I look at and others, as we're talking about, it's maybe more. There's more facets to this challenge. But I wonder if is it 1 conflict over 4 zones, or is it 4 conflicts with intersections, or using Mr. Lister's term, interlinked conflicts?
Congressman, I mean, I guess you could apply almost either terminology to it. I think that the point from my point of view is that you can't treat Syria as one problem, in a sense. In fact, you have distinct but perhaps overlapping problems. So, for example, we have the problem that's erupted in recent days of the Turks and the Kurds and their tensions with one another and clashes with one another now. We have the problem of Iran and Hezbollah trying to establish a presence along the Golan Heights. We have the problem potentially of, if there's renewed fighting in the south, refugees flowing into Jordan, and the Jordanians feeling as though they have to do something perhaps to push ISIS back from their own borders. And then we also have the sort of issue that really we're focused on in this hearing of Western Syria and the plight of civilians who are caught between the Assad regime and its backers and the opposition, which is, as I said, increasingly jihadist dominated in that area. So these are all sort of parts of the Syria conflict. But I think that to make good policy, we may need to look at them not separately, not totally distinctly, but as sort of discrete problems, if you know what I mean.
Dr. Annan, I don't know if you had a comment or to that.
Concurrence.
Okay. As I try to understand what's happening, and again, thank you for sharing your insights, it seems that we need to have certainly a multifaceted strategy, if not overlaying strategies that are distinct. You know, on the one level, that we've got this humanitarian crisis that we have to deal with not just the internally displaced, but the pressures it's putting on the region. Mr. Singh, as you touched on, we have the regional issues and what's happening at the north along the Turkish border is distinct of what's happening on the highway between Damascus and Aleppo, distinct what's happening near the Golan. And having that strategy on a regional, and then the global, and we're running out of time, but the issue of the prospect of a failed state in Iran being a haven for terrorist groups, and Mr. Lister, thank you for emphasizing al-Qaeda, because it's not just ISIS. We have to have a strategy that deals with all of those. So I guess I'm going to finish with a statement before a question because I'm out of time, but it's so imperative that we have the administration here sharing with us so that Congress can exercise its responsibility to understand and ultimately make the decision of what role the United States should be playing in these conflicts. So with that, I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. We'll now go to Chairman McCall from Texas.
All right, thank the chairman. My first question is to Mr. Lister, and maybe for the panel. I've been briefed on this Democratic Federation of Northern Syria that operates obviously in the northern part of the country. On December 29th, the 165 leaders, Kurdish, Christian, Yazidi, and Arab populations came together to form a council and declare the creation of a government known at the Democratic Federation of Northern Syria, known as. It was sort of intriguing to me. I know some of our special forces may be working with them to defeat ISIS, but what intrigued me about this group was that at some point, if and when Assad falls, we're going to have some model of governance, some template for the country. And I think that's something that we have seen historically in the past. We've made mistakes on. When a dictator falls and there's no governance, then the terrorists take over. And so my question is, can you tell me more about this federation and the prospects of it and other groups like it becoming sort of a model of governance?
Sure. Well, the formation you speak of is essentially a result of the Kurdish YPG's policy in northeastern Syria, which is to establish a semi-autonomous region of the country, either with or without the tacit acceptance of the United States and with or without the tacit acceptance of the Assad regime, both of whom it retains contacts with. You know, many of the underpinning philosophies underpinning it are good and laudable. The idea of, you know, freedom of representation in theory, the theory of equal opportunities for the sexes is all good, and there are many, many more. There are problems with it, though. Within this federation territory, it has become all the more common now for any comments of opposition or any other Kurdish parties that aren't the YPG have had their offices raided, burnt down, arrested. It is now illegal, according to that federation, for any of the leaders of those other Kurdish parties to even enter the territory. So it's potentially a good stabilizing measure in the interim period, but it isn't part of a solution that I can see other Syrians in the rest of the country being part of.
Is it something the United States should be supporting?
In the interim, perhaps, yes. I mean, because it works for now. It has stabilized northeastern Syria. It has resulted in the defeat of ISIS in those areas. But we need to be very, very aware of how poisonous, and I use that word, how poisonous the YPG's political philosophy is perceived by Syrians on both sides of the opposition regime conflict. There are significant fears. I will end just by saying I was part of a significant Track 2 process for 3 years, which involved almost 1,000 Syrians from across all sides of the conflict, highly influential people in their own regard. The only actor not involved in that process was the PYD, the political wing of the YPG. And the only reason for that is nearly every single Syrian involved in that process said they would boycott the process if the PYD was involved. It's just worth us remembering that using that as a model for the rest of Syria will not work, whilst it may work in the northeast. But it's not translatable for the rest of the country.
Well, following on the YPG, on Tuesday, Turkey launched an airstrike against groups, Kurds, including the YPG in Syria. We've been working with them to defeat ISIS. I know there were communications to Turkey not to do this. The President is meeting with President Erdogan next month. As a member of NATO, how do you propose that the United States balance this issue?
Well, I would refer you to my earlier testimony and to my prepared remarks. I referred to the fact that Turkey has many faults, but also we have many faults with this situation. We have pretended that the YPG isn't part of the PKK, which is a designated terrorist organization in this country. PKK is also the primary national security threat for Turkey, and it has been for 30 or 40 years. So there are things we do need to do to build confidence back up with the Turks, and the primary policy recommendation I would have there in the immediate term is to try to encourage or force Turkey to reconsider a ceasefire with the PKK inside Turkey, which would then have the positive knock-on effect of de-intensifying the hostilities between Turkey and the YPG. For me, that's the only way around it.
Yeah, I assume the other witnesses agree with this assessment?
Yes, this is exactly right. I would just add that the president and the new administration seems to be trying to warm relationships with Turkey. There was a number of phone calls, including after the referendum 10 days ago, congratulating President Erdogan. This is new warm relationship has to be translated into tough talk and negotiations on these types of issues to promise to work on the YPG issue in exchange for restraint and not to target people that our special forces are working with and partnering with.
Thank you. I see my time has expired.
Thank you for those questions. We'll now go to Mr. Espiat from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, and esteemed witnesses. Thank you for your excellent and enlightening testimony. I don't mean to pile on, but however, so far in Congress and with full control of both the Senate, the House, and the White House, it is perplexing that we have not heard from a State Department official who might really play a constructive role in answering some of the questions that we may have. Yesterday we heard from Secretary of State Tillerson and General Mattis on the North Korea issue, and we have not used military force there yet. And so I think it is imperative that we hear from the administration on their plan, their strategic long-term plan to address this humanitarian crisis in Syria. And close to 500,000 civilians have died, exactly 480,000, and 14 million people have been displaced, and maybe 50 or more % of the country the infrastructure has been destroyed. So this is truly a humanitarian crisis, and beyond the attack on the airfield, we have not really heard from the President or his administration on the long-term strategic plan to deal with this particular humanitarian crisis. And we saw how, while he warned the Russians of the planned military action, he ordered the launch of 59 Tomahawks on Sharat airfield in Syria. And he very emotionally and appropriately stated that Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. And it was a slow and brutal death for many of them. And so, but less than 24 hours after the attack, the Syrian government and their Russian allies were able to continue to fly missions out of the airfield. When will they fly another mission with chemical weapons? That's the question that we must all ask ourselves. In fact, there are recent allegations that even after the airfield attack, and the regime has used chlorine gas against civilians. And so we want to know, I want to ask, is there any evidence, have you heard of any evidence of this being true? That they have, in fact, after the Syrian attack, they have used other chemical weapons on the Syrian people?
Briefly, yes. As much evidence as we can glean without being there ourselves. Doctors on the ground have treated chlorine-like symptoms, difficulty breathing, tearing from the eyes, in, as far as I'm aware, at least 3 different locations since our cruise missile strikes, including one of the times which was literally the day after our cruise missile strike. And those attacks have taken place just outside Damascus and elsewhere in the north of the country.
So the bombing of the airfield has not deterred the Assad regime from continuing in its bad ways. And so we must hear from the administration on a strategic long-term plan in the region. The President, in his first 100 days, has issued executive orders to put a 4-month hold on allowing refugees into the United States. We just heard in the past days how his assistant and first daughter, Ivanka, contradicted that particular policy, saying that allowing Syrian refugees into the United States has to be part of the discussion. Maybe we should allow that statement into the record, Mr. Chairman. But we must continue to highlight America's long-standing tradition to offer humanitarian aid and allow refugees from troubled parts of the world to enter America, where they will be protected and shielded from bodily harm. This is an important component of who we are as a nation, and we must continue to look in that direction. Trump is proposing cuts on the State Department, and we heard how General Mattis has stated that if we cut diplomacy, we must buy additional bullets. And so we are in this crossroad where we have not heard from the administration. We're proposing cuts on the State Department. The Assad regime continues to violate human rights. We are not clear where we're going, and yet we're not speaking to each other. And we speak to each other about North Korea as we should, and yet we have not used physical force there. So we must continue to support refugees coming in. We have a good vetting system to ensure that they're not here to harm our nation. And whether there are children being killed in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Syria, they are children that we should help across the world. And I'm asking President Trump to reverse his course on the executive order and to come to Congress with a long-term foreign policy strategy on Syria. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. It's now my turn, and so I'm going to ask you guys, and I appreciate your patience being here. I want to go back to the subject of this hearing, Syria after the missile strikes, policy options. I was torn when President Trump ordered those Tomahawk missiles in there because I was a strong opponent of President Obama going in there when they were going to do the no-fly zones, because we saw what happens with no-fly zones in Libya. Leads to a failed state. There's nobody to take over, and that was our concern back then. And this was a limited strike. And I want to go back to some of the stuff that you said. Mr. Lister, you noted that the mode of death within, whether it's the bombs, the bullets I threw in, beheading, or chemicals, is still death. But the chemical weapons have been deemed an unacceptable form of warfare. And if we go back to the Chemical Weapons Convention, it comprehensively prohibits the use, the development, the production, stockpiling, and transfer of chemical weapons. Any chemical used for warfare is considered a chemical weapon by the convention. And then we have the chlorine barrel bombs that Assad has been using, and we have written bills to prevent that. We can't get the traction because everybody says chlorine's not considered a use. But within the Chemical Weapons Treaty, it says the use of any toxic chemical as a weapon when used to produce fatality solely or majoritively through its toxic action is in of itself forbidden by the treaty. So my question to you is, we've got pretty much every country in the world has signed on to the CWC. There's 4 of them that haven't. So the consensus is, with all the countries, the 192 that have agreed to this, is that chemical weapons should not be used. So we're in agreement there. Is there an enforcement mechanism, or is it just an agreement? We're not going to use them. And if somebody crosses that red line and uses them, is there an international response written down anywhere? And if not, would you recommend there should be? And it should be a national coalition of all nations. What's your thoughts, Mr. Singh?
Well, Congressman, thanks for the question. I confess I'm not an expert in the CWC, so I'm not sure I have the answer to your questions. But I think if the treaty is going to mean anything, and it's a lesson also for other nonproliferation treaties, which we put a lot of emphasis on. There have to be sanctions, there have to be penalties for those who violate them, and it can't just be American penalties and American sanctions, it needs to be international.
And that's what I want to come out of this, so that it gives clarity for a nation, because I don't want America to have to do this alone, but after 5 years of slaughter over there and pushing 500,000 people, and as Ms. Titus brought up, you know, this administration's done nothing. Well, we can blame a lot of administrations for not doing anything, and we need to have the clarification of if this does happen and we have signed on to these agreements, somebody needs to back them up. Mr. Lister, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm also not an expert on the treaty either, or the convention, but and I would echo what Mr. Singh has said. It is our responsibility as an international community to enforce conventions like this.
All right. I know you guys aren't the experts or, you know, want to talk about, you know, the policy side of that, but you are experts in your fields. So I'm asking you to give us the information that you would draft as far as a wording that we could go to the UN and say, we want this, or go to our State Department and say, we want this wording put in the international community, that if you cross this red line, not just America, but all the members that have signed up to this are coming after you. Dr. Rand, and then Mr. Lister, you said you looked like you had something else to add.
I'll just finish. I think the responsibility to protect is a useful mechanism here. If chemical weapons are proven to be being used against civilian populations repeatedly, that may give us one opportunity under some kind of a UN mandate to at least push for some kind of response and consequences for it. Yeah, that's what I'd offer.
Dr. Ann?
I would agree with the R2P, the responsibility to protect method of advancing this. But I would also add that, last week at the UN, there was a resolution, or 2 weeks ago, right after the missile strikes, to condemn it and to investigate it, and Russia vetoed it. In fact, on the one paragraph on the information about they didn't like the way it was worded or something. But I think this is the main diplomatic task ahead, is to go back on this particular strike and ensure that there's an investigation, because that's part of the norm against CW, is that the international community goes in and investigates and holds accountable the individuals, including by name, by the way. The OPCW has been very good at finding the perpetrators in the past 2 years. It has actually published lists of names of
And my goal is that we have an enforcement mechanism that has teeth behind it, because that's the only way I could justify what President Trump did, is the slaughter that's been going on for over 5 years, that it has to be brought to an end. And if we just sit by as a world, we're all guilty of watching this happen. And so I'm glad he stepped in, but before we go any further, we need to have clarification. And my time's out, and we'll go now to Mr. Brad Sherman from California.
Thank you. We have 3 separate goals in Syria, and there's a tendency to mash them together. We've got to keep them separate, evaluate every policy as to whether it helps at least one of those goals without setting back one of the others. And we shouldn't attack a proposal just because it does nothing to achieve 2 of our goals, if it in fact helps us achieve one of the 3 goals. Our first goal is to protect the Syrian people, and we would eventually like to see good governance in Syria. Our second goal is to destroy ISIS, and our third goal is to preserve the Chemical Weapons Convention that bans the use of poison gas. And there has been discussion here about how the mode of death doesn't matter. You're just as dead if you're hit by a bullet or a bomb as if you're hit with sarin. But the fact is that we live in a world in which mankind at least achieved the Chemical Weapons Convention. One could write a counter history where chemical weapons were invented before gunpowder, and in that counter history, chemical weapons are allowed and explosives are not. But that's not the way history unfolded. We have a convention against the use of chemical weapons that has saved countless millions of lives, and it's worth standing up for that convention, even if we realize that Assad has killed 500,000 people, or the war that he created has killed 500,000 people, and only a very, very small percentage of those died from chemical weapons. Now, not only do we have those 3 goals, the Syrian people, ISIS, and the Chemical Weapons Convention, they're not equally important goals, but we have a couple of caveats, and that is we want to do that all without excessive U.S. casualties and without a war with Russia. We don't want another Iraq war. We don't want another Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, one of our colleagues said that he thought that there was a moral equivalence between Assad and other authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. I would say Mubarak did not kill hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, he allowed himself to be, or was allowed to leave power rather than killing hundreds of thousands. Not every authoritarian regime in the Middle East is responsible for aiding the killing of hundreds of Americans, as Mr. Lister pointed out. The Assad regime is. Not every Middle East authoritarian regime has tried to develop nuclear weapons the way Syria did until they were bombed in 2007, and no doubt they paid North Korea for the material and the technology, so they proliferated in that direction as well. That's money in the hands of North Korea. And there are 500,000 dead Syrians. That does not equate to Erdogan. And I've been one of the harshest critics of Erdogan on this committee. The Obama administration forced Assad to give up 2,600 pounds of chemical weapons. That was a tremendous accomplishment. And our hope is that the action taken by President Trump will prevent Assad from using whatever he has left. We will have to see. There's discussion of chlorine versus other chemical agents. It's my understanding that the Chemical Weapons Convention would prohibit Syria from even possessing sarin and other chemical agents. They're allowed to possess chlorine. You can't have a modern society without chlorine and chlorinated water, but it prohibits the use of chlorine as a weapon. And of course, when chlorine is used, you can't always be sure it was the Assad regime. Chlorine is a much more available item, and the rebels or the terrorists or others might have it. The question I have requires an understanding of Russian politics, so I don't see a volunteer. Maybe you could comment for the record. And that is, there is, among other things in the Middle East, a civil war between Shiites and Sunnis. The Russians have adopted the Shiites. Their own Muslim population is overwhelmingly Sunni. How does Putin, a man who at least asserts that his hold on power is dependent upon the consent of the governed, side with the Shiites in this effort without an incredible blowback? We all have ethnic and religious communities in our districts, and I doubt that that we would fail to take into account their historical view in looking at international affairs. Does anybody have a comment on how and why Putin can side with the Shiites when he's got tens of millions of Sunnis?
Very briefly, just academically, I would push back on the idea that Syria, at least within the frame of reference of Syria, that it is all just about Shia versus Sunni. There are many Sunnis who have remained loyal to the Assad regime as they have turned to the opposition. And Russia has actually tried to frame it that way domestically.
But Hezbollah and Iran are there supporting Assad out of a Shiite.
Exactly, but Russia has tried to frame its policy in Syria, domestically, as not being protecting the Shia. It's also worth remembering one thing that's going on right now, which is having very little media coverage in Aleppo city. Having captured it, the Russian government is now trying very hard to prevent Iran and the Assad regime from populating eastern Aleppo, which was previously under the opposition control. It's trying to prevent them from populating that area with Shia. And it is insisting that Sunnis, including from opposition areas, should be given the opportunity to come back to eastern Aleppo. And so I would remind that it's a little more complicated domestically and also on Syria than the binary.
Gentleman's time has expired. I think the gentleman chair recognizes the chair for 5 minutes. I just want to dispel very quickly, there's a lot of talk about non-intervention in Syria and using Libya as the example. I think it's really important to point out that Libya has massive challenges. Part of that was a failure in follow-up after regime change, I believe. But secondly, if you compare the case of intervention in Libya versus the case of non-intervention in Syria, Libya, with all its challenges, is far better off than not intervened in Syria. I remember back in 2013, I was one of the few Republicans outspoken about the need to enforce the red line in Syria, and I heard from people all over, a lot in my own party, some members on this committee, that said if we intervene and we strike Syria, it will begin World War III. And another major intervention in Syria, in the Middle East, World War III will commence and everybody will be gone. I'd like to point out that also people said that if we intervene, it will get way worse in Syria. But when we didn't intervene, it actually got way worse than we ever could have imagined, which is where we're at today. So as we look at going forward, and we imagine all the terrible possibilities, and probably most of them are terrible, I'd like to remind people that I think it can get even worse than it is right now, which is almost unimaginable. As Mr. Lister mentioned in his statement, a very important thing happened after the strike on the air base in Syria, which is the people who sat around and said that what are the Russians going to do? They got their question answered, which is absolutely nothing. They do not have the ability to respond, to react. Russia is not the former Soviet Union. It is a military where half of its planes can't even fly, and it's very underfunded. So I think that's important to note, too, as we look at what we're going to do going forward. Mr. Lister, let me ask you a question. What is Bashar al-Assad's ultimate fear? What is the one thing that if we push on that button would drive President Assad, dictator Assad, to the table to negotiate?
My theory would be his ultimate fear is America gets really serious about Syria and not just about ISIS. The only substantive evidence I can recall for that is back in August 2013, after the chemical weapons attack, in the brief period of time where it looked like the United States may conduct limited punitive strikes. I knew Syrians who were in Damascus at the time on the government side who said that nearly half of the Syrian parliament packed up their homes and fled to Lebanon because they feared that limited, very limited, American military action was going to set forth a chain of events that would have completely caused chaos within the regime, not the state, that the regime's inner circles. So the biggest fear for Assad isn't terrorism. In fact, he has used terrorism for his own means, not just during this crisis, but before. His biggest fear is that we get serious about solving Syria. And he's enjoyed the last 6 years because we haven't.
So would you say that ultimately he fears his own life in that process? So if he would lose power in the regime or his life or whatever, that is what can be used as a trigger point to drive to a negotiated solution. Because short of that, short of any fear of losing power, he has no incentive whatsoever to negotiate an end to this war on anything but his own terms. So I guess my point is, as the administration goes forward, they ought to look at using further airstrikes against regime targets as a method to drive a negotiated solution here. It's the diplomatic instrument of power against an adversary can only be effective when backed by the military instrument of power. We see that in North Korea, and we see that here. Let me ask you another question. Can Bashar al-Assad ever gain ultimate control of all of Syria again? I mean, short of the entire world backing his regime. Can he ever gain control of Syria?
You can't discount anything, but if he's going to militarily conquer the rest of his country, it's going to take a very, very, very long time. And it's going to cause a huge further exodus of civilians and many, many more deaths. And it could take 10, 20, 30 years to do so. So the real answer is effectively no, if the answer is that he's then putting the country back together again. You know, that's, yeah, it's as simple as that.
So without a strategy against Assad, be it negotiated or otherwise, you see part of regime-controlled territory, and you see a large part of the country, which is Afghanistan pre-9/11, basically, with some terrorist groups, some opposition groups running around. So what would Assad staying in power, very briefly, because my time's up, what does that do to the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria?
Okay, as fast as possible. Al-Qaeda has spent the last 6 years embedding itself in the opposition narrative in Syria. It has devoted all of its resources to fighting Assad, not creating an Islamic State, not fighting a transnational jihad. And for that reason only, the continued existence of Assad in Damascus and his continued brutality against his people every single day emboldens al-Qaeda's narrative in the eyes of other Syrians who don't buy into a transnational jihad. And this is the fear. Every single day, more and more people think, maybe this group's got it right. They've always told us the international community will never come to our aid. So because they're right, because they're there, because they're powerful on the battlefield, maybe these are the guys that we should be joining. And that's the state where we are in today.
Thank you. My time's expired. I think it's Mr. Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Chairman and Ranking Member for calling this hearing. Thank you to our witnesses. It's been 3 weeks since President Trump launched a missile attack against the Assad regime, and we're no closer to achieving a solution to this crisis. The Trump administration has not formulated any coherent policy to address ISIS or the ongoing atrocities being committed against the Syrian people by Bashar al-Assad. In actuality, the inconsistency and confusion displayed by members of the Trump administration has emboldened Assad and his patron, Vladimir Putin. The monstrous chemical weapons attack deployed against innocent civilians, including women and children, came just days after Secretary of State Tillerson signaled to Assad and Putin that the United States was willing to accept Assad's continued role, which represented a stark turnaround from previous American policy. And in the meantime, President Trump continues to push for his cruel and unnecessary ban on Syrian refugees, as well as draconian cuts to our foreign affairs budget, Each of these actions will only worsen the suffering of the Syrian people, and that's why I, along with Congressman Beyer and Congresswoman Jayapal, are leading a letter to President Trump asking him to reverse his executive order and support funding for humanitarian assistance. And finally, I'm extremely troubled by the administration's seeming lack of understanding of the constitutionally mandated congressional oversight of American military action. If the president intends to escalate our military involvement further, as he's indicated he will consider, then he has a responsibility to send a plan to Congress and seek authorization for any further action. And so my questions are really, I have two. One is, the humanitarian assistance budget is expected to be decimated if President Trump's budget is adopted. Would you speak to how these proposed cuts would affect the United States' ability to work towards stability in Syria and in neighboring countries that are taking on the enormous burden of housing the large majority of Syrian refugees, particularly our ally Jordan?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman, for that important set of questions. First, on the refugee ban, it's interesting that the media actually hasn't covered the foreign policy disadvantages of the refugee ban, because, you know, Syria's neighbors are taking in 4 million, 5 million Syrian refugees. The generosity of the Turks, the Jordanians, the Lebanese, and other neighbors is incredible. And so, you know, last year in 2016, the U.S. took in 12,000 Syrian refugees. I mean, that's nothing compared to these smaller and less, you know, less well-off countries. So we're trying to convince our allies surrounding Syria to be generous toward these refugees, to continue to give them housing, to continue to give them education, to continue to work with the UN and other international organizations. And that's a really important signal that hasn't been covered. So I just wanted to mention that because we haven't discussed that so far today. Specifically on the humanitarian budget, it's unclear because there's still reports of what the cuts will be, but the cuts to humanitarian assistance, international development account, the IDA account, cuts to the food aid budget will all significantly affect Syrians, both refugees, also the IDPs who have stayed within Syria. And then the cuts to ESF, to the economic support funds, to the Jordanian government are very concerning. I mean, it's confusing as to why you would cut ESF to one of your closest partners and allies in the region that is both being generous to the Syrian refugees, but trying to help you in some of the counterterrorism operations that we've discussed today.
Thank you. Finally, I just would ask any of the panelists, you know, we always have discussions about a military solution to this conflict, and I think in the absence of American boots on the ground, which I strongly oppose, I wonder whether there is a military solution, what that would look like, and if not, if it is exclusively a diplomatic solution, you know, what's the strategy or your recommendations as to how we get to that? Mr. Singh?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I'd personally say that, as in so many of these situations, there's no exclusively military solution, there's no exclusively diplomatic solution. That ultimately, to the extent our policies are successful, they're successful when we combine all of our tools, diplomatic, military, aid, intelligence, and so forth, and when we do it in conjunction with allies, with a coalition of like-minded countries. And I think that's what's going to be required here. I do think that, frankly, the April 7th strike is useful in building the credibility of American threats of force. I, for one, would say that it may be that, look, we already have some American boots on the ground. It may be that there's a role for some more, but I don't think it should be the United States in front, sort of taking on the sort of heaviest military roles. That should be up to our local partners. But I think it's going to be force backed by diplomacy, diplomacy backed by force, which is going to be part of the answer here.
Anyone else?
I agree.
Great. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri, Ms. Wagner. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important hearing. It's high time that the United States grapple strategically with how to end the Syrian conflict. It is patently clear that there can be no resolution with Assad in power, especially as he continues to prioritize a war against moderate groups seeking democracy over a war against ISIS. His slaughter of innocent civilians is barbaric, and the United States cannot hope to defeat ISIS with Assad as the only alternative. Dr. Rand, The Southern Front has been effective in keeping extremist groups from expanding control in southern Syria. How can we, along with our allies in Israel and Jordan, further support the Southern Front and help them protect against Assad?
Thanks, Congresswoman. This is an important issue, and actually, because of the focus on Idlib and Aleppo in the past year or so, I think a lot of the attention has shifted away from the Southern Front, so I think it's important to raise it again. You know, a year and a half ago, the governance or so of the Southern Front provided kind of a model of a multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian type of governance. They issued a communique talking about inclusion and representation among the different sects that seemed quite hopeful and seemed potentially a paradigm that could be transported for other parts of Syria. So the key here, I think, is twofold. One is to support the continued moderation of the leadership of the Southern Front to make sure they continue to support different ethnic groups and you know, there's some inclusion of al-Qaeda elements, and I'll let my colleague talk about it, but overall they've been more moderate than some of the other oppositionists. But second is to support them in their counterterrorism needs against ISIS and other more extremists that might challenge their hegemony in this part of Syria.
Well, Mr. Lister, thank you, Dr. Rand. Mr. Lister, can you discuss coordination between Kurdish forces such as the SDF and YPG and, frankly, and other moderate forces and, I'll say, local groups? In what ways could the U.S. help advance cooperation between the Kurdish and moderate forces across the country to ensure that areas freed from the Assad regime can, in fact, remain free of terrorism?
Again, that's a very important question. I mean, I think what I've tried to focus on in part in my remarks is to suggest that Syria can't be looked at as a whole, right? So what we've seen develop in the northeast with the Kurdish YPG and its various allies is one specific component of a much broader reality. What works in the northeast doesn't work in the south. We're not going to see a reflection of the Kurdish Confederation in the northeast suddenly appearing in southern Syria with a predominantly Sunni Arab population. So I think we should, you know, kind of take care of what we've helped to develop in the northeast, but we also need to also be aware of the negative knock-on effects of some of these other actors' actions. And so I genuinely am concerned that if we pursue what I think we will pursue, which is a YPG, SDF-led offensive on Raqqa, they will very seriously consider whether it takes 1 month or 12 months, some kind of power-sharing agreement with the Assad regime.
Power-sharing agreement.
That kind, it's already happened. As I said in my opening remarks, in northern Aleppo, they've handed territory over to the Assad regime. Now, if that happens in Raqqa, that is a jihadist's dream. It fulfills everything they have said for 6 years, that not only will the West not help protect your civilians, but eventually they'll come in and do their selfish thing, which is fight terrorism, and then eventually they'll give it over to the dictator again. So we must be very, very careful of preventing a scenario like that from coming true. And comments from senior military officials here that we have no control over the decisions of our local partners, frankly, is a cop-out.
It is a cop-out. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Singh, the Assad regime uses aerial bombardment and terrorizing weapons to strategically displace the civilian populations in opposition areas. In what ways have Sunni extremist forces and pro-Iranian militias taken advantage of Assad's attacks and displacement of civilians?
Well, I think that it's an important question, Congresswoman, and Mr. Lister referred to this before, but I think there's no doubt that the brutalization of civilians, the brutalization of the populations, is a boon to the extremist groups who, as Mr. Lister pointed out, play on this sort of anti-Assad narrative to boost their own fortunes. And we've seen exactly that occur because we have seen, I think, especially in western Syria, the extremist forces amongst the opposition gain in strength in recent months. As for the Iranians, I think, are complicit in Assad's actions. And so it's not necessarily right to talk about them gaining from them. They're actually part of those actions because it's the Iranians that I think have the greatest force on the ground backing Assad, and I think we need to ascribe blame to them for much of what he does.
I agree. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time has run out.
Thank you. The chair would now recognize Mr. Swazi from New York for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by stating the obvious, which is this is incredibly complicated. And I want to thank all of you for sharing your knowledge with us today. I'm going to echo what all my colleagues have said, is that we really need to hear from the administration as to what their plan is to address this very complicated part of the world. There's an epic struggle going on in the world, and unlike the Cold War, where it was clear that it was the Soviets versus the Americans, this is much more complicated. It's stability versus instability. It's control versus chaos, as Tom Friedman said in his book. And we've gone from 35 million refugees in the world 10 years ago to 65 million refugees today, and many of them are from Syria. And as the doctor pointed out in her testimony a few minutes ago, this is destabilizing other countries as they try and deal with all these refugees in Jordan and Lebanon and in other countries, in Turkey. And this region is so complicated by the fact there are so many parties involved with Assad and Iran and Russia, and then the rebel forces, America, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, the Turks, don't like the Kurds. I mean, it's so many moving pieces here, and it's so complicated. But we have to choose in this world that is facing this struggle of stability versus instability where we're going to focus our resources and where we have to make choices as to where we're going to pay attention and what we're going to do. And we've heard from, I think it was Brad Sherman before and Congressman Kinzinger about some of these choices we have to make. And for me, let's put chemical weapons aside, which I think there's bipartisan international agreement that we have to, combat the best way that we can. But if the choice is between, for right now, what's right in front of us, and you have to choose between fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria or trying to protect the Syrian people and undoing Assad and forcing him to the negotiating table. You have to choose between those two. What's the most important thing in front of the United States right now in our national interest? Is it to combat Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or is it to stop Assad and force him to the negotiating table? Which is the most important thing before us right now? And you have to choose, each one of you. Mr. Singh, you go first.
I'm going to disappoint you because I think it's a false choice, frankly. I think that if you sort of go back to my initial statement, I think, in fact, we have now sort of several discrete conflicts which are going on within Syria that implicate our interests in the region and implicate the security of our allies. And we can't neglect one for the sake of the other. We have to address all of them. But it's a mistake to think, as Mr. Lister has said, that we can address all of them together in one neat package or look at them as one problem to be solved. We have to address them sort of in a distinct way. So in eastern Syria, there's no doubt that our priority has to be defeating ISIS, and then not just defeating ISIS, but thinking about what comes next, because we don't want ISIS to return. But
the focus now is on Raqqa.
On Raqqa, right? In western Syria, though, absolutely, the continued sort of brutality of the Assad regime, the expansion of Iranian power, the expansion of Hezbollah's power is a tremendous concern, not just for us, but for Israel, for Turkey, for our allies.
Now, I've learned somewhere that 85% of the population of Syria is in western Syria. Is that correct? Okay.
That's correct.
I may briefly, I mentioned in an earlier answer that we have found ourselves capable for about 2 years to combat ISIS primarily in isolation from the rest of the conflict. But we're now discovering that when we reach Raqqa, which is an Arab town, there are big knock-on effects of doing that with certain actors, and we're finding suddenly the proliferation of knock-on effects along the northern Syrian border. And it's for that reason that I would agree with my colleague, Mr. Singh, that combating terrorism in Syria and protecting civilians are inextricably linked. Terrorist narratives, no matter what kind of terrorist you are, is linked to the fact that there is suffering, chaos, instability, and brutality in their world.
So that's empowering them.
And it's empowering them like nothing else that would be possible. And so I would suggest it is impossible for us to win against terrorism, whatever that might mean, without encompassing that strategy, protection of civilians, a de-intensification of the conflict, and challenging the Assad regime's freedom to use any means at his disposal to continue to kill people en masse.
Doctor?
Thank you. I would agree completely about the inextricability between these two options. And I would give as an example something we've talked about extensively today that I think exemplifies this, right? After Raqqa is liberated, there will be a number of political, governance, and humanitarian questions before us, essentially, as those who have trained the militias that oust the ISIS terrorists. And those include who will govern, whether they're Kurdish and Arab, and how much leverage we can push on them to not hand over territory to the regime. Those questions will affect how much we can protect the civilians in that liberated area of Syria. And those are things within our purview, within our power, within our leverage, through our training and assisting of the partners that will do the liberation. So
I know my time has expired. I just want to make this one last point. By us going after ISIS and al-Qaeda, which is in our own self-interest, obviously, in our national security interest, we must do it, we're aiding Assad and Russia and Iran in the process. Because they have the same enemy. Anyway. I'm sorry.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. The chair would yield to the chair. I want to be really clear in expressing my high esteem and regard for my honorable colleagues who've spoken earlier, but I've rarely seen such a mind-numbing display of misinformation and disinformation, so I want to clear some things up. My colleague from Nevada previously mentioned over 500,000 killed, quote, by the Assad regime. In fact, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates, and that's the highest estimate of deaths in the conflict, that there have been roughly 500,000 casualties, that about a third of those have been to pro-regime forces, that is deaths. I presume then that Mr. Assad is not responsible for all 500,000 casualties. Is that an accurate assessment, Ms. Rand, Dr. Rand?
this is, the different human rights organizations have different estimates. They range between.
The question is President Assad responsible for all 500,000 deaths in Syria?
At least 80% of those 5.
Okay, so the fact that a third of the deaths have been to pro-regime forces, you're intimating then that he killed about 1/3 of that third himself?
No, there's also there's civilians that have lost their lives because of Russian.
Right. I would direct your attention to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights and their statistics. My colleague from Nevada also made reference to a Moab drop. That was actually about 2,300 miles away in Afghanistan, right? That wasn't actually in Syria, was it? Yeah, so that would be some misinformation. And then she made reference to no cohesive foreign policy strategy that we've seen from this administration. Mr. Singh, the Trump administration was sworn in about January 20th of 2017, is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. And so the Syrian civil war really began in earnest, as did other events in the Arab Spring, roughly 2010, 2011, and was sort of co-opted by first al-Qaeda, and then ISIS moved in to fill a vacuum in the east of the nation probably about 6 or 7 years ago.
Absolutely right.
And would you characterize the U.S. foreign policy, particularly through the State Department, from 2011 forward as cohesive and clearly articulated?
Absolutely not. We had no serious strategy, I think.
And so if in fact U.S. policy is not cohesive and clearly articulated now, that's no departure from the previous 6+ years?
Well, it certainly isn't, but I agree with you, Congressman, that it's still early going, and so my hope is that the Trump administration will be coming forward with this.
And so too do I. I really do, because I would agree that there is not a clearly articulated policy, but that there hasn't been one, and that the previous administration had, by my rough mathematical estimates, about 24 times as much time to formulate one. So we also have recent open source intelligence that relates to what has been our stated goal, that is to attack and crush ISIS in Syria. And would it not be your agreement, Mr. Lister, that the number of airstrikes and attacks directly on ISIS assets since January 20th, 2017 have been stepped up, and that the apparent success of those attacks is greater than heretofore?
I can't speak personally to have seen statistics that suggest that, but it wouldn't surprise me because we are entering, of course, the phase of an intensive operation for Raqqa.
Okay, and there was also an intimation by one of my colleagues that it was inappropriate to have warned the Russians of an impending United States military strike on a facility where Russian forces were probably co-located. Would you agree with the idea that we shouldn't have let the Russians know that there were inbound explosive-tipped cruise missiles?
Well, I would disagree that it was wrong to do that. I mean, we do have deconfliction protocols, and to me, it's prudent to have warned the Russians in the way that we did.
Right. In fact, had we not warned the Russians might have been even more incensed by the American action without any sort of heads up, if you will, pardon the colloquialism. Now, were there regime chemical weapons attacks prior to the assumption of power of the Trump administration?
Yes, there sure were. Absolutely.
Okay, and there were also chemical weapons attacks, to be fair, perpetrated by Jabhat al-Nusra, Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham, obviously a renaming of al-Nusra, who's sort of infiltrated by al-Qaeda. That they've used chlorine as well, we think, as has ISIS.
I'm not sure I have the best information, but I think I would draw a distinction between the types of chemical attacks, sarin attacks, and so forth, and the types of attacks you're talking about, Congressman.
Okay. Is it fair to say that there aren't a whole lot of clean hands as it goes around to atrocities committed in Syria? For example, perhaps, you know, setting aflame a Jordanian captured pilot wasn't perpetrated, to our knowledge, by the regime?
Right, but there have been atrocities committed by several sides in this conflict.
Sure. I mean, in fact, I would argue everybody.
Congressman, I would just add on that point, there's no moral equivalency between what the regime has done and what the other actors have done. I mean, the regime is responsible for the vast amount of the destruction.
Okay. Well, I haven't asked this question yet, but so let me make sure I understand this right. Okay. We've got ISIS. We understand who they are. We've got Jabhat al-Fatah al-Sham, who is a sort of derivative of al-Nusra Front. It's fair to say that al-Nusra was sort of co-opted by al-Qaeda, correct? In the north, regionally strong, we have YPG and Kurds, but they don't have any real desire based on tribal affinity to rule the nation, nor would the nation accept a Kurdish-led rule. And so if we're going to start establishing moral equivalencies, then would we rather ISIS, al-Qaeda, or the Assad regime to be in charge? Now, that's a rhetorical question. The bottom line I think that I'm driving at is, before we engage in regime change activities, we ought to have a plan on who's going to fill the vacuum that we create. Because what 5.5 million to 6.5 million displaced people have in common is they didn't want to be displaced. But this nation led from behind, in our own words, and worked to create vacuums by encouraging uprisings and revolts without any regard for who would fill the vacuum. And we saw Christians beheaded on the beaches in Libya, and we see 500,000 dead by the hands of many bloody actors in Syria, and we're partly responsible. We should not engage in regime change activities without contemplating who fills the vacuum that we create. Would you agree, Mr. Lister?
Frankly speaking, it's not about regime change. It's about upholding international norms to ensure that governments don't commit repeated war crimes on a daily basis. And our objective, so far as I'm concerned, is not regime change. We're not invading the country like we did in Iraq. It's to set up conditions that will allow a political process to be more meaningful, and for all actors on all sides to treat it seriously.
So I couldn't agree more, and that sort of jives with what Secretary Tillerson had indicated to the Russians before the missile strike on the airfield. That is, we don't have to see Assad go, but we have to see stability and peace in the region. That should be our goal.
Well, I mean, the conclusion of the political process is up to Syrians. I think we ought to have, morally, a conclusion that Assad should go, but it's not our choice to make that decision. But it is our responsibility as a significant portion of the international community to allow all Syrians to have that choice.
Right.
They haven't had it for 6 years.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. And I've gone way over.
Will the gentleman yield?
I've gone way over, so I would yield.
You would not yield?
I'm out of time.
You could still yield to me. You're in the chair.
No, I'm not going to yield.
You're not going to yield. Well, I'm sorry that the bipartisanship that we've had here for so many years, that you don't follow the lead of the chairman and myself.
Well, I apologize.
I'm really very sorry about that.
I forgive you.
I have been on this committee.
I
don't need your forgiveness.
I don't understand the.
I don't need your forgiveness.
Well, you've
Let
been
me
on this
tell you.
committee long enough to know the protocol, and I
Long enough
don't.
to
So
know
I
that
would
when-
yield you 30 seconds. Thank you.
It's common courtesy that people are yielded time when they ask their colleagues. Let me just say, first of all, that when I grew up, I learned from my parents that two wrongs don't make a right. Many of us on this side of the aisle were critical of the previous administration and what it did, and we said so at the time. There's no reason to not be critical of what's happening in the current administration just because the other administration didn't do what should have been done. I will agree with you, and I've been saying this for years, that we made a misstep when we did not aid and help the Free Syrian Army way back when, and we made a mistake when the previous president drew a line in the sand and then didn't follow through. But that doesn't absolve the current administration from its responsibility, and its responsibility has been that it needs to come to Congress with any plan that it has. It needs to tell us what their what their attempts are in Syria and what their goals are. We have learned for many, many years, giving any administration a blank check to create war is not something that this Congress should do. And I think there's no doubt in my mind and in everybody else's mind that Assad is really the butcher of Syria. That yes, there have been killings on both sides, but it was the Assad regime's reaction to the Arab Spring when peaceful Syrians went out to demonstrate against their dictatorial government, that Assad decided he would respond with deadly force. And so I blame all the atrocities that happened in Syria on the bloody hands of Assad, because had he not acted the way he acted, this would not have happened. I just want to set the record straight. I do agree that there were missteps by the previous administration, but that doesn't mean that we have to overlook missteps by this administration. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, and I apologize again to Mr. Engel as it relates to not yielding. I did not literally know the protocol of the committee, so I'll take that lump, new guy. I want to thank the time of the witnesses today. These are very critical issues. Your expertise and insight is important, and I think, candidly, despite the tone that some of this took, we all want the same thing, and that is a world in which people can live where they choose to live, free from fear of persecution or death. And Syria is one where, if we ultimately get it right, we might take a good step in the right direction towards ensuring that going forward in the future, because it's certainly a tough rubric. Thank you very much.